"So you're really coming to our wedding?" Lily, my brother's fiancée, said. "I'll be embarrassed to introduce you as my sister-in-law to our relatives. My name is Katie, I'm 37 years old and single. I dropped out of school, but I'm not ashamed of it or my single status. In fact, I'm proud because it allowed me to live a happy life with my family. I come from a poor family, my father wasn't around, and my mother had me and my younger brother, Georgie, who's 2 years younger than me. She worked hard to support us, but we often struggled to make ends meet. Sometimes, a relative would try to give my mom money, but she always refused, saying, 'Let us only rely on you when we're really desperate. We're okay for now.' When I asked her why, she said, 'If I take the money, his wife might get upset.' I secretly wished she had accepted the help. Georgie was a very smart kid and always top of his class in school. As his proud older sister, I thought he was going to do amazing things in life. His teacher even recommended him for a top school, but we didn't have the money for it. He ended up going to a less prestigious school, and I felt awful about it. To make up for it, I dropped out of school and started working right away. The truth is, I didn't like studying, so I saw this as a chance to start working. However, most jobs for people who dropped out didn't pay well. I ended up working in a small office, but when the office owner retired, he recommended me to a better company, and I got a good paying job there. I worked hard and even became a manager at 35, earning a salary similar to other college graduates. However, my brother's fiancée, Lily, doesn't seem to like that I'm a dropout, especially since Georgie graduated from a prestigious university and is now doing well as a salesman at ABC Trading. Lily seems to think I'm a failure because I didn't go to college. I was surprised when Georgie told me that Lily had asked, "Is your sister some kind of problem person?" Lily's dad is a director at ABC Trading, and she's very attractive, but I'm not sure she's a nice person. Once, she came to our house, but when she saw our modest apartment, she refused to come inside and even complained, even though I was dressed up nicely. Lily seemed embarrassed by my family and didn't like that Georgie, her boyfriend, was commuting from our modest place. She used her father's position as the head of a department to get Georgie moved into company housing. Even though he wasn't supposed to be eligible, she made up an excuse, saying they would live there once they were married. The catch was that only approved people could visit the company housing, and even close family members had to apply each time. I joked, saying, "I guess I can't visit often, I just wanted to peek at your happy new life." But Lily's mother responded coldly, saying, "That's exactly why we decided to have them live in a family house." Lily was rude to my mother when she visited. She whispered to Georgie, out of earshot, "Your mother-in-law is poor. Georgie will have to keep paying his student loans even after marriage. It's natural for parents to pay for tuition, right?" And she gave my mom a mean look. The truth is, my mom and I saved money for Georgie's college fund, but he insisted on paying for it himself. Lily and her mom have tough personalities, but Georgie knows this, even though they act like they're important, like celebrities. I also wanted my mom to move into the company housing, but Lily said the husband's siblings can't live there, so I'd be left alone, which she found pitiful. When I told her that I graduated from college on a scholarship, Lily's mom pretended to be impressed, saying, "You must want to help your mom as soon as possible. You're such a thoughtful and wonderful person." Lily's family talked about how kind they were, and at first, I thought there was no need to say anything bad about them, but that was a mistake. Lily and her family started to exclude both me and my mom, especially me. Half a month before the wedding, Lily suddenly contacted me, asking if I was going to attend. Georgie is my only brother, but the wedding venue was very fancy, with around 150 guests expected. They even invited the president and managing director of ABC Corporation and other high-level clients, since Georgie's marriage to the daughter of the head of the department was a big deal. I thought they might not have enough room for me at the wedding, but then Lily said, "I think the guests will feel uncomfortable if there's a poor-looking sister-in-law." I was shocked. "What do you mean by poor-looking?" I asked. "I plan to wear a proper formal outfit for the wedding." Lily responded, "Your proper outfit is probably a cheap suit from a catalog, right? It's embarrassing to be surrounded by people wearing high-end brand clothes." She had clearly judged me as being at the bottom of the social ladder. I was fed up with her attitude that poor people shouldn't be invited to her wedding, so I asked, "What about my mother? She doesn't have high-end brand clothes either." Lily replied, "I know, but I can't not invite Georgie, who's doing well at the company. I just don't want to be embarrassed by you or your relatives, so we'll get your mom some nice clothes." I was really upset by how she was speaking, But I tried to tell myself it was just her way of being considerate so my mom wouldn't be embarrassed at Georgie's big event. But then Lily said something that took me by surprise. Of course, you'll have to buy that dress. It's an Oscar de la Renta evening dress, so you'll need to prepare about $10,000. I was stunned. Wait, I can't afford that. Lily coldly replied, if you can't pay, then do you plan to stand next to my parents in a cheap dress? I couldn't believe it and asked what Georgie thought. Lily said, I haven't told Georgie yet. Of course, he thinks you and your mother will come, but it'll hurt his future if his mother is unmarried and his sister is a dropout. I don't think being a single mother or a dropout affects someone's career anymore. I didn't want to let Lily's prejudice get to me, so I yelled, this is my only brother's wedding, so both my mom and I will attend. We'll pay for our clothes, but if you can't stand us, just don't invite us. I told my mom everything and asked for her advice. She seemed sad for a moment but then smiled and said, don't worry, Katie, I promised you I'll make Georgie happy, just leave it to me. She then made a phone call, and I had no idea what she was planning. On the wedding day, the ceremony was held in the chapel. I had been worried about whether or not to tell Georgie what Lily had said, but since I'd left everything to my mom, I decided to stay quiet. However, Georgie looked tense. Was it just nerves, or had my mom said something to him? After the ceremony, I was shocked when I looked at the seating chart for the reception. My mother's name was the only one in the family section, and I couldn't find my name anywhere. I thought, wait, there's no seat for me? They were really trying to exclude me from the reception. Just then, Lily's parents showed up and gave me a look of disdain. They said, I can't believe you didn't understand when Lily told you not to come to the reception. We let you attend the ceremony because we had no choice, but we don't want you spreading your poverty around at the reception. Go home, dropout sister. I thought, like mother, like daughter, fine, I'll go home. As I turned away from Lily's parents, who were smirking, I saw the CEO of Nico Mimi Corporation, a listed company and business partner of Lily's father, standing with Georgie. Mr. Ashcroft smiled at me and said, Katie, you're in the way, sorry about that. Lily's parents replied, we were just getting rid of an unwanted guest. Then Mr. Ashcroft spoke up, if you insist on kicking Katie out, then I, as her father, will also leave the reception. I was shocked. Father? Wait, what do you mean? I asked. Lily's parents stared at him, confused, not believing what he was saying. Mr. Ashcroft repeated, as I said, Katie is my daughter. It turned out that Mr. Ashcroft and my mother had been in a relationship when they were in their 20s. At the time, Mr. Ashcroft was an executive and on his way to becoming the CEO, while my mother had lost both of her parents in an accident and was left alone. Their relationship wasn't accepted from the start. When my mother got pregnant with me, Nico Mimi Corporation, Mr. Ashcroft's father's company, was about to go bankrupt. Everyone opposed their marriage, saying it wouldn't help the company, so my mother decided to put their marriage on hold until the company was in a better situation. She raised me as a single mother, even though it was hard because of the stigma. By the time my mother was pregnant with Georgie, the company still hadn't improved much. Then the daughter of a CEO from another company offered to help, and she proposed marriage to Mr. Ashcroft. My mother, seeing how important it was for him to revive the company, decided to step aside. She told him, I'll raise our 2 kids properly, you don't have to acknowledge them, just be happy with that woman and revive your company. After marrying the CEO's daughter, Mr. Ashcroft not only revived the company but grew it so much that it became a listed company. However, they didn't have any children and divorced a year ago because of his wife's infidelity. After the divorce, Mr. Ashcroft reached out to my mother and proposed that they reunite. A few days before Georgie's wedding, I met with Mr. Ashcroft, the company president, and my father. I suddenly recognized the man standing with Georgie. He was the same man who had visited our apartment a few times during my childhood, trying to give my mother money. He turned out to be Mr. Ashcroft, the president of Nico Mimi Corporation. When I stared at him, he smiled and said, You've really been through a lot. I've heard about the wedding from your mother. Mr. Ashcroft, who was now Georgie's business partner, knew how capable Georgie was. He wanted Georgie to take over Nico Mimi Corporation, but he was concerned if Georgie couldn't see the true nature of malicious people, like Lily and her family, and didn't respect his mother and sister. Mr. Ashcroft couldn't trust him with the company, so he was using the wedding to test Georgie's character. The day before the wedding, Mr. Ashcroft and my mother told Georgie the truth about their past relationship and how Lily's family was trying to exclude us. Shocked by all the revelations, Georgie, who had trusted Lily and her parents, felt uneasy about the wedding. That's why he looked so stiff during the ceremony. When Georgie saw that my name wasn't on the seating chart and saw Lily's parents trying to kick me out of the reception, he knew what my mother and I had told him was true. He took Lily to the reception desk and declared, "Lily, Mr. and Mrs. Lily, I'm annulling this marriage. I have no intention of becoming a part of a family that disrespects my precious mother and sister." Lily and her parents were shocked. Lily, not understanding the situation, said, "Georgie, are you choosing that low-life mother and daughter over me? You should know your place." Lily's parents turned pale and tried to stop her, but it was too late. I explained everything to Lily, and she collapsed, crying. Mr. Ashcroft added, "I guess we'll have to reconsider our business with your company," which caused Lily's parents to burst into tears and beg for forgiveness. Everyone at the reception witnessed this, and the whole event was cancelled. Georgie completely cut ties with Lily and refused to submit the marriage registration. Afterward, I received a furious phone call from Lily, screaming, "You're the reason." Lily called me later and said, "I couldn't marry Georgie. I'll be billing you for compensation and the cancellation fee for the venue." I responded, "Oh really? Then I'll sue you for defamation. Everyone at the reception heard you and your parents using abusive language." She went silent. I then added, "I should probably tell your father that I was threatened by Lily. If I do, Nikomimi Corporation might completely stop doing business with ABC Trading. Won't your dad lose his job then?" Lily started crying, but I just hung up the phone. Serves her right. Georgie, who had cancelled his marriage to Lily, later joined Nikomimi Corporation and worked hard to become his father's right-hand man. Now, my parents are getting married soon. My mother, who is shy about having a wedding at her age, looks genuinely happy when we pick out her wedding dress together. I've always been focused on my work, but now I'm starting to think that maybe one day, I'd like to wear my mother's wedding dress.
My name is Rachel Palmer. I'm 37, and just last week, I attended a professional gala where I was being honored for my work in research and education. It was a night I'd been anticipating for weeks, a celebration of everything I'd built over the years. But as fate would have it, the moment I stepped into the restroom to take a breather, I came face to face with someone I hadn't seen in nearly 15 years. My mother. She was at the sink, reapplying her lipstick, looking every bit the part of the wealthy socialite she'd always been. For a moment, I thought maybe she wouldn't recognize me, but then her eyes flicked up to the mirror and landed on my reflection. Her hand froze mid-motion, and I saw her jaw tighten. "Rachel," she said, her voice cool and detached, like we'd just bumped into each other at a country club instead of a bathroom after 15 years of silence. "I didn't expect to see you here." I steadied myself, gripping the edge of my clutch. "I could say the same," I replied, keeping my tone even. "What brings you here?" She turned to face me, her posture as rigid as ever. "Your father and I were invited, of course. We've always been involved with organizations that support education. And you?" "I'm being honored tonight," I said, meeting her gaze. "For my work and research." Her expression barely shifted, but I caught the faintest flicker of surprise in her eyes before she masked it. "I see," she said, turning back to the mirror. "Well, I suppose everyone finds their way eventually." Her words brought me back to the day I walked out of that house for the last time. I was 19, and the years leading up to that moment hadn't been easy. In high school, I struggled with depression, but in my family, that wasn't something you admitted. "What could you possibly be sad about?" my mother had said once, her voice dripping with irritation when I tried to open up to her. "You have everything, more than most kids your age. You're just making excuses." The truth was, I'd been drowning. The pressure to be perfect, to live up to the Palmer name, was suffocating. I tried to keep up, but my grades started slipping during my junior year, and by senior year, I was barely holding on. My parents didn't see a kid who needed help. They saw a failure, an embarrassment. When I only got into a community college, my father's fury was unmatched. "This family has standards," he had said that night, pacing the living room while I stood there clutching my acceptance letter. "And you've done nothing but drag us down. You want to waste your life? Fine. But you'll do it on your own." I had been kicked out of the house. I remember the weight of that duffel bag as I left the house that night. It wasn't just filled with clothes. It held the reality of being completely on my own. My parents didn't even come to the door to say goodbye. My mother stayed seated on the couch, scrolling through her phone as if I didn't exist. My father had disappeared into his study after delivering his ultimatum. I felt invisible, discarded, like I'd never been a part of their world to begin with. For the first few weeks, I stayed with a friend, sleeping on her pull-out couch while I tried to figure out my next steps. Community college wasn't glamorous, but it felt like the only thing I could control. I worked part-time at a diner to cover tuition and rent when I finally scraped together enough to move into a tiny studio apartment. It was a grind, balancing classes, work, and the overwhelming sense of failure that clung to me like a second skin. But something about being on my own, away from their constant judgment, gave me a flicker of hope. For the first time, I could breathe, even if the air felt thin. My first year at community college was a blur of late-night study sessions and endless shifts at the diner. I'd decided to study chemistry, partly because I genuinely enjoyed it, and partly because I wanted to prove to myself, and maybe even to them, that I could excel in something challenging. It wasn't easy. My high school grades had been mediocre at best, and I felt like I was starting from behind compared to my classmates. But for the first time in years, I wasn't under the crushing weight of their expectations. I could just focus on learning. I still remember my first chemistry exam. I'd spent weeks preparing, going over every formula, every reaction, until I could practically recite them in my sleep. When the professor handed back the graded tests, I was terrified to look. But there it was, a 92%. I nearly cried, right there in the middle of the classroom. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I'd earned it. It felt like the first small step toward rebuilding myself after everything had fallen apart. Over the years, I evolved in ways I never expected. College wasn't easy, but I had learned how to work for what I wanted. And the more I gave, the more I saw myself grow. By the time I finished my associate's degree, I wasn't just a student anymore. I was someone who had learned how to fight for her place in the world. I transferred to a 4-year university, and while I still faced obstacles, I had learned how to push through them. The shy, insecure girl who barely got by in high school had become someone who could stand in front of a class, explain complex concepts, and hold her own. Chemistry, once a challenge, became my passion. I didn't just want to pass anymore. I wanted to excel, to prove that I wasn't the failure they thought I was. I worked part-time, still, but I also started interning at local research labs, gaining experience that eventually led me to an opportunity I never imagined, becoming a lead researcher at a nonprofit focused on advancing science education. It wasn't just a job. It was my way of giving back, of creating a space where other kids, the ones who were told they weren't good enough, could find their way too. Graduating with my bachelor's degree was supposed to be a moment of triumph, but when it came time to celebrate, I realized something. My parents hadn't even called. Not to congratulate me, not to ask about my plans. Nothing. My father, the owner of a massive fertilizer company, had more money than he knew what to do with. He and my mother lived in a mansion, threw extravagant parties, and rubbed elbows with politicians and CEOs. But for all their wealth, they'd never taken an interest in me unless it was to criticize. Even after I graduated with honors, after I'd worked my ass off to get where I was, I didn't exist in their world. I was a reminder of their failure, an inconvenient blemish on their perfect lives. It stung more than I wanted to admit. I had hoped, maybe foolishly, that they'd at least acknowledge the hard work I'd put in. But they didn't. It was as if I never mattered to them, and that realization hit harder than I cared to admit. The only family member who bothered to show up at my graduation ceremony was Aunt Lydia. She was my mother's younger sister, the black sheep of the family. Lydia had never cared much for my parents' rigid standards, and while they shunned her for being too eccentric, she was always kind to me. She was the one person who would call on my birthday, even when my parents pretended I didn't exist. When I saw her in the crowd, I felt a lump form in my throat. She waved at me excitedly from the back, and after the ceremony, I found her in the parking lot, waiting with a huge bouquet of flowers. "You did it, kid," she said, pulling me into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you." It was a small comfort, but it was something. It wasn't the cold silence I'd gotten from my parents. Aunt Lydia was the one who reminded me that family didn't have to mean perfection, that love could come from unexpected places. She didn't care that I hadn't followed the straight path they wanted for me. She cared that I had made it on my own, no matter the hurdles. A few months after graduation, I was wrapping up a research project at the university when one of my professors, Dr. Collins, pulled me aside. He was an old-school chemist, the kind who had a passion for the periodic table like it was a work of art. He'd noticed my work ethic, my persistence despite everything I'd been through. "Rachel," he said, his voice low and thoughtful, "I've been in touch with some colleagues at Oxford University. They're offering a research opportunity in environmental chemistry, and I think you'd be a perfect fit." At first I thought it was a joke. Oxford? One of the most prestigious universities in the world? Me? But Dr. Collins insisted. He told me that this wasn't just a job, it was a chance to make real contributions to the field, and that I deserved the opportunity. "Don't let fear hold you back, Rachel," he said. "You've proven yourself. Now it's time to take that next step." I applied, hesitantly at first, not fully believing it could happen. The application process was rigorous, and I wasn't sure I'd make the cut. But then, weeks later, I received an email. "We are pleased to inform you that you've been awarded a research grant for your proposed work in environmental chemistry at Oxford University." I moved to England without telling anyone. Not my parents, not any of my old friends. The only person who knew was Aunt Lydia. I called her a few days before I left, and she was the one who encouraged me to go. "You've worked too hard to let anything hold you back," she said. "Do this for yourself, Rachel." She understood why I needed to disappear, why I needed to escape the shadows of my past and carve out a new future without anyone's expectations hanging over me. I asked Lydia not to tell anyone else where I'd gone. I didn't want them to try and find me, didn't want the weight of their judgment pulling me back. So, I left, boarding a plane to Oxford, with nothing but a backpack, and the faint hope that this could be my chance to finally become the person I always dreamed of being. I settled into a small flat in Oxford and threw myself into my work. The first few weeks were tough, the language, the culture, the isolation. But the more I immersed myself in my research, the more I felt at home. I was working on projects that mattered, things that could make a real impact on the world. The chemistry I studied was no longer just about passing exams or proving myself to my parents. It was about changing the future. As the years passed, I completed my master's degree, and then, driven by the momentum of my research, I applied for a PhD. The process was grueling, but I was determined. I had found my place at Oxford, and there was no turning back. After several years of sleepless nights and endless lab experiments, I earned my PhD, becoming a respected researcher in the field of environmental chemistry. After finishing my PhD, the next step seemed almost too surreal to grasp. I was offered a position as a professor at the University of Cambridge. It felt like a dream I never dared to chase, not because I didn't think I deserved it, but because I never imagined I would be given the chance. I had worked so hard to get to this point, and yet, the recognition still felt like it was happening to someone else. At Cambridge, I was able to teach and mentor the next generation of students, something I hadn't expected to find so fulfilling. The freedom to shape minds, to pass on the knowledge and passion I'd gained, was beyond anything I could have imagined back when I was struggling through community college. I had gone from being the girl who didn't belong to someone who could stand at the front of a classroom and be taken seriously. But there was still a piece of me that was always looking over my shoulder, wondering if anyone back home knew where I was, if anyone cared enough to find out. I hadn't heard from my parents since I left. No calls, no letters, no attempts to reach out. I wondered if they even thought about me. As my mother turned back to the mirror, adjusting her lipstick, I felt a familiar weight settle in my chest. Her words, "Everyone finds their way eventually," echoed in my head, and I couldn't help but wonder if she really believed it. I thought about all those years I spent trying to meet their expectations, all the ways they told me I wasn't good enough. The community college rejection, the years of silence, and the way they acted like I didn't exist once I walked out of their house. It felt like a lifetime ago, but standing there in that bathroom, the bitterness still stung. I had worked so hard to get to this point, leaving everything behind, moving to England, finishing my master's and PhD, becoming a professor at Cambridge. And yet, there she was, standing in front of me, acting like my entire journey had been some kind of afterthought. I had gone from being the failure they cast aside to someone who could now speak at international conferences, lead research, and mentor young minds. And for what? To stand here and have her offer me nothing more than a cold acknowledgement? As she left the bathroom, I watched her glide out of the door, back to the people she was comfortable with. I thought about the woman I had become, the woman who'd erased every trace of them from my life. I didn't need their approval anymore. I'd built a life on my own terms, and even though they would never understand, that was enough. The gala ceremony began shortly after my mother disappeared into the crowd. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the weight of that encounter. The clinking of glasses, the hum of polite conversation. It all felt distant now. It was time to take my place, to step into the role I had fought so hard to claim. The stage was set, the lights shining down on the sea of well-dressed guests, and the moment I had been anticipating for months was finally here. I made my way to the front, where they called my name, the words echoing through the room. Rachel Palmer, honored for her groundbreaking contributions to education and sustainable chemistry. The applause was deafening, but it felt strangely hollow, like I was listening to someone else's life unfold. I took the stage, trying to maintain a calm exterior, but inside, all I could think about was the fact that I was standing in front of an audience of people who knew nothing of the path I had taken to get here. No idea what it had cost me to get this far. The spotlight hit me, and I could feel my heart racing in my chest. This wasn't just a recognition of my work in chemistry. This was my way of showing the world that I was more than the person my parents had tried to make me believe I was. This was the moment where I stood on my own 2 feet, with nothing to prove to anyone but myself. As I stood there, still trying to absorb the magnitude of the moment, the host's voice rang out, drawing everyone's attention. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have an exciting announcement. In recognition of the groundbreaking work in education and sustainable chemistry that will be honored tonight, a generous and anonymous donor has pledged a grant of $2 million to the recipient of this award. The room went quiet, and I felt every pair of eyes in the room shift toward me. My heart raced. This extraordinary contribution is intended to support the continued efforts of the recipient's research and further their impact on the world of education. I blinked, momentarily stunned. $2 million. The number hung in the air, surreal and overwhelming. But the announcement wasn't directly for me. It was for the recipient of the award, someone whose name hadn't been revealed yet. I was still processing everything when I heard the host's voice continue. This grant, though anonymous, will be bestowed upon the person tonight who has demonstrated exceptional dedication to their work in advancing chemistry and education. For a moment, I didn't know what to think. The enormity of the sum, the way it would change someone's life, was astounding. But there was something else in the air, something I couldn't shake. The realization that the donor didn't know it would be me. They didn't know I was the one being honored tonight. As the announcement echoed through the room, my eyes wandered across the crowd, trying to catch a glimpse of the people around me. But then, something caught my attention. A subtle shift in the crowd. Near the back, just beside the exit, I saw him. My father. He stood up abruptly, his face twisted in disgust. His eyes met mine for a brief moment, before he turned sharply and began to make his way toward the door. His movements were swift and deliberate, as if he couldn't get out of that room fast enough. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The man who had rejected me all those years ago, the one who had kicked me out of his house, was leaving as soon as he heard the news of the grant. He didn't even stay to see who was being recognized for the award. My chest tightened as a mix of emotions washed over me: anger, disbelief, and something darker, more bitter. This was the moment I had been waiting for. A moment where everything I had worked for was finally being acknowledged, and he couldn't even bring himself to stay in the room to witness it. He couldn't stomach the fact that the daughter he had written off was now standing at the front of the room, receiving everything he had always expected from someone else. As my father made his way toward the exit, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The strange weight of his sudden departure settled over me, but before I could process it, the announcer's voice sliced through the room again. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host continued, "we are incredibly fortunate to not only have a generous donor for tonight's award, but also a longtime supporter of education and sustainable chemistry. The $2 million grant, which will be awarded to the recipient of this honor, has been made possible through the contributions of Mosaic Fertilizers, a company led by one of the most influential figures in the fertilizer industry." Mosaic Fertilizers. My father's company. I froze. The donor, the one whose generosity had made this award possible, was my father's company. My chest tightened as the truth hit me. The man who had spent years treating me like an embarrassment, the one who had walked out of the room when he learned of my success, was the one funding this recognition. The irony stung deeply. The same man who rejected my path, who disowned me for pursuing a life that didn't fit into his perfect image, had unknowingly backed the very award that would be the crowning achievement of my career. It was almost too much to process, too much to bear in that moment. I stood there stunned as the announcer's words continued to echo in my ears. The applause around me felt distant, like I was hearing it from underwater. The weight of the grant, of everything that had just been revealed, hung heavily on me. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a brief moment I couldn't process any of it. "Thank you," I managed to say into the microphone, my voice shaky but steady enough. The words felt hollow, too small for what I was feeling, but I didn't have time to think about it. I had to get out of that room. I couldn't stand there another second, basking in the recognition that felt so empty. I turned abruptly, walked off the stage, and without another glance at the audience, I bolted for the back door. My steps quickened as I made my way through the hallway, heart racing, only one thought running through my mind. My father. I knew he'd left the room. I saw him walk out, his face a mixture of disgust and something else I couldn't quite read. But he couldn't just leave. Not like this. Not when everything had come full circle. I couldn't let it end like this, with him walking out on the one moment that proved everything he had tried to dismiss about me. I pushed through the door leading outside, scanning the area, my breath coming in quick bursts. There he was, standing by his car, his back to me. My feet moved on their own, and before I could stop myself, I was running. "Dad!" I called out, my voice almost cracking as I rushed after him. He didn't look back at first, his shoulders stiff, but when he finally turned around, I saw the bitter expression on his face. He had that same look I remembered from all those years ago, like everything was an insult to him. "What is it now, Rachel?" he asked sharply, his voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "You think I'm going to congratulate you?" I stopped just a few feet away, my heart hammering in my chest. I knew what this was about. He had no idea who the recipient of the grant was until they called my name. Until that moment, he thought he was just funding some good cause, sending money to the foundation, believing it was going to some worthy academic or researcher he could proudly point to. He didn't know it would be me standing there on that stage. He sneered, his lips curling into a bitter smile. I don't know whether to be disgusted or impressed, but here you are, taking my money. I'm sure that's exactly what you wanted, right? I could see the resentment in his eyes. The grant, $2 million, had come from Mosaic Fertilizers, his company. But once the money was donated to the foundation, it was entirely out of his control. They had chosen who would receive it, and they chose me. The irony hit me like a wave. "I didn't ask for this," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the rush of emotions. "I never asked for your money or your approval. I earned this on my own, just like everything else." His eyes darkened and he shook his head. "It doesn't change anything. You're still the failure I kicked out of my house all those years ago. No grant or award is going to change that." I felt a rush of anger, but I pushed it down. "It doesn't matter what you think anymore. I've made my own life. And if that money came from you, it doesn't mean anything to me." I turned my back on him without saying another word, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't need to argue with him anymore. He wouldn't understand, and truthfully, I didn't need his approval. I had spent so many years trying to prove myself to him, and for what? To be here, at this moment, with everything I had worked for, only for him to stand there bitter and resentful of my success? It wasn't worth my time. The next day, I made a decision. I had spent the night thinking about what the $2 million grant meant. At first, it had felt like a victory, a vindication. But by morning, that feeling had faded. It wasn't my victory. It was just another reminder of everything I had escaped. The money, tied to his company, was never going to erase the years of pain and rejection. It wasn't going to heal the part of me that he had broken when he kicked me out of the house all those years ago. So, I donated the entire sum, every last cent of it. I didn't want it. Not from him, not with the strings that came attached to it. Instead, I directed it toward funding scholarships for underprivileged students who had been overlooked, underestimated, and written off. I wanted to give them the chance to build something for themselves, without being crushed under the weight of expectations that didn't belong to them. The money that had once been tied to rejection and bitterness was now part of something greater, something that would outlast the sting of my father's judgment. I felt a quiet satisfaction as I pressed the donation button. For the first time, I realized that I didn't need his money, his approval, or his recognition. I had built my own legacy, one that would live on far beyond the walls of that gala.
How could you forget something so basic, Clara? Emily would never be so careless. Beatrice's sharp tone cut through the soft hum of the kitchen fan, her words wrapping around me like a noose. I paused mid-stir, gripping the wooden spoon tighter as my chest tightened. The pot of soup simmered on the stove, its aroma filling the air. But all I could smell was the bitterness in her words. My name is Clara Mason. I'm 32, a nurse, and for the past 3 weeks, the caregiver to my recovering mother-in-law. When Beatrice had surgery last month, I moved into her house, balancing my shifts at the hospital with endless nights by her side. I wanted to help, not out of obligation, but because it felt like the right thing to do. I hoped it might soften the years of cold distance between us. But no matter how much I tried, It seemed my efforts were always invisible, overshadowed by Emily, her perfect daughter, who breezed in once a week, smiling for the camera before leaving just as quickly. I didn't know how to respond. My throat felt dry, and the words I wanted to say caught like thorns in my chest. Beatrice turned back to the table, muttering something under her breath, her disapproval settling over the room like a heavy fog. Emily, of course, was nowhere to be found. She was already running late for her weekly appearance. And yet, Beatrice spoke of her as if she were the one standing here, ladle in hand, taking care of her every need. Careless. That word felt like a knife twisting in my stomach. I had given up everything for the past 3 weeks, canceled plans, traded shifts, even missed my anniversary dinner with Ben, all to be here. And for what? To be labeled careless because I hadn't added enough salt to the soup? Meanwhile, Emily could float in for an hour, snap a selfie by Beatrice's bedside, and walk out with all the credit. I stared into the pot, my hand trembling slightly as I stirred. Anger began to simmer, bubbling just below the surface. It wasn't just Beatrice's words. It was the smugness Emily exuded in every moment of her carefully orchestrated visits. She knew exactly how to frame herself as the devoted daughter, and she knew I wouldn't fight back. At least not until now. Just as I opened my mouth to defend myself, the front door creaked open, and Emily strolled in, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "Smells good in here," she chirped, holding a bouquet of flowers in one hand and her phone in the other, as though she'd just dropped by to brighten everyone's day. She glanced at me briefly, her smile lingering a second too long, then turned her attention to Beatrice. "How's my favorite patient today?" she cooed, leaning down to kiss her mother on the cheek. Beatrice's face lit up, her earlier frustration with me vanishing like a puff of smoke. "Emily, sweetheart, you're just in time. I was telling Clara how important it is to pay attention to the little things." Not that she'd understand, she added with a pointed glance in my direction. Emily set the flowers on the counter and let out a soft laugh. "Oh, Mom, I'm sure Clara's doing her best," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. She turned to me, her expression unreadable. "Don't worry, Clara. Taking care of Mom isn't easy. I've been learning that myself." I clenched my jaw, the words hanging on the tip of my tongue, begging to be said. But Emily was already moving, pulling her phone out for what I knew was coming next. She posed next to Beatrice, leaning in with a radiant smile as her camera clicked. "Just want to capture these precious moments," she said, her voice light, as if she hadn't just stolen the spotlight from everything I'd been working tirelessly to hold together. As Emily scrolled through her phone, probably selecting the best filter to enhance her devoted daughter persona, Beatrice sighed contentedly. "It's so nice to have both my girls here," she said, her gaze lingering on Emily. Though I'll admit, Emily always knows just how to make me feel special. My grip tightened on the ladle, the weight of her words pressing down on me. Both her girls? Special? I had spent the last 3 nights waking up every 2 hours to help Beatrice shift positions, prepare her medication, and ensure she was comfortable. Meanwhile, Emily's contribution amounted to curated snapshots and vague reassurances that she was always thinking of Mom. "Mom," Emily began, her tone casually breezy, "I was actually thinking of bringing you that herbal tea you love next week. You know, the one from that little shop downtown? It's just been so busy at work, but I'll make time." "Oh, Emily, that sounds wonderful," Beatrice exclaimed, her eyes practically glowing with pride. "You're always so thoughtful." I couldn't stop myself this time. "Thoughtful?" I blurted, my voice sharper than I intended. Both Beatrice and Emily turned to me, Beatrice's brows knitting together in confusion. "She drops by once a week to take a few photos and then disappears. I've been here every single day doing everything I can to make sure you're comfortable." Emily's smile didn't falter. If anything, it grew wider, but her eyes flashed with something colder. "Clara," she said, her voice calm and measured, "I didn't realize this was a competition. We're all doing our part in our own way." "Some more than others," I muttered under my breath, turning back to the stove. I could feel the tension in the room shift, but I wasn't about to let her patronizing tone get the last word. The moment the words left my mouth, regret washed over me. Even though I was right, I hated that I'd let my frustration spill over, that I'd stooped to making it sound like I was keeping score. It wasn't who I wanted to be, no matter how unfair things felt. Later that evening, I slipped into the guest room, shutting the door quietly behind me. I sank onto the edge of the bed, my phone already in my hand. Ben picked up on the second ring, his voice warm but distracted. "Hey, everything okay?" "No," I said, the word tumbling out before I could stop it. "I'm exhausted, Ben. I've been doing everything for your mom, everything, and she doesn't even notice. Emily walks in for 10 minutes with flowers and a fake smile, and suddenly she's the perfect daughter." Ben sighed heavily on the other end, the sound crackling through the speaker. "Clara, you know how my mom is. She's always been like this. You can't take it personally." "I know she's like this," I snapped, my voice sharper than I meant. "But that doesn't make it easier. Do you have any idea what it feels like to be here, day in and day out, and still be invisible? I stopped, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I just needed you to understand." Ben's voice softened, a hint of concern cutting through his usual practicality. "Clara, maybe it's time to take a break. You've done more than enough. You've done everything, honestly. Why don't you come home for a week? Let Emily step up for once. I miss you, and you need to take care of yourself too." His words caught me off guard, the knot in my chest loosening slightly. The thought of going home, of sleeping in my own bed and being with Ben, was so tempting it almost hurt. But then I thought of Beatrice, her frailty, her stubbornness, and the nagging guilt in my stomach returned. "I don't know," I said quietly. "What if she needs me?" "She'll manage," Ben said firmly. "You've been more than generous, Clara. It's okay to step back. You're not a bad person for putting yourself first for once." Ben and I lived 2 hours away in a small apartment we'd made our home over the last 5 years. When Beatrice's surgery was scheduled, I'd offered to move in temporarily to help with her recovery. Ben had wanted to be there too. He adored his mom despite her quirks, but his job was at a critical point, with deadlines he couldn't ignore. He'd called every day to check in, always asking how I was holding up, but I knew it weighed on him that he couldn't be here to share the burden. As much as I missed him, I couldn't blame him. He was doing the best he could, just like I was. I sighed, gripping the phone a little tighter. "I don't know, Ben," I said finally. "It's not that I don't want to come home, I do. I miss you, and I'm exhausted. But I can't just leave her like this. She still needs someone here." There was a brief silence on the other end before Ben spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "I get it, Clara. You care about her, even if she doesn't always show it. Just think about it, okay? You've done so much already. It's not selfish to take care of yourself, too." "I'll think about it," I said quietly, my throat tightening. "I promise." It felt like the right thing to say, even though I wasn't sure if I could really let myself walk away. The next morning, I found Beatrice in the living room, sitting upright in her chair with the television on low. She didn't look up as I entered, her attention fixed on a weather report. I hesitated, wondering if I should start the conversation with a simple, "Good morning." But before I could speak, she turned to me with a pointed look. "Clara," she said, her tone already laced with irritation. "I couldn't help but notice how late dinner was last night. It's not good for my digestion to eat that late, you know." I blinked, taken aback. "Dinner was ready as soon as Emily left. I thought we agreed." "Yes, because you didn't have it prepared earlier," she interrupted, her words sharp. "When Emily is here, everything feels more put together. She doesn't need to be told what to do." I clenched my hands at my sides, biting back the words I wanted to say. "Emily stayed for less than an hour," I replied carefully. "She didn't even stay for dinner." "That's not the point," Beatrice snapped, leaning forward slightly. "Emily knows how to handle herself. She doesn't wait for me to tell her when or how to do things. She's considerate. I let out a slow breath, trying to keep my composure. I've been here every day, Beatrice. I've been doing everything I can to make sure you're comfortable. And yet, somehow, it always feels like a struggle, she shot back, her voice growing colder. You're here physically, Clara, but emotionally, you're checked out. You don't seem like you actually want to be here. Her words struck like a blow, my chest tightening. That's not fair, I said, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. I've put my life on hold to be here for you. I've been... Sacrificing? She cut in, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Oh, how noble of you. If it's such a burden, Clara, maybe you should have just let Emily handle it. She's busy, yes, but at least she doesn't make me feel like I'm an inconvenience. I opened my mouth, then closed it, unsure of how to respond. The hurt and anger bubbled inside me, but I knew saying anything more would only make it worse. Instead, I straightened, my voice quiet but firm. I'm doing my best, Beatrice. I'm sorry if that's not enough. She waved a hand dismissively, turning back to the television. Your best isn't what I need, Clara. Emily understands me in ways you never will. The room felt suffocating, her words hanging in the air like smoke. Without another word, I turned and left, retreating to the guest room to collect myself. Tears pricked at my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not yet. Not in front of her. Sitting on the edge of the guest bed, I stared at the neatly folded clothes in my suitcase, my thoughts swirling. Beatrice's words replayed in my mind, each one digging deeper into the ache that had been building for weeks. No matter how much I gave, how much I tried, it was never enough. And it never would be. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my messages, landing on the last one from Ben. You've done enough, Clara. Please come home. The words felt heavier now, but they also carried a clarity I hadn't wanted to admit before. Ben was right. I had done enough. I'd given up my time, my energy, and my peace of mind to be here, hoping it might make a difference. But nothing I did would ever compare to the pedestal Beatrice had placed Emily on. I couldn't keep sacrificing myself for someone who didn't see me, who didn't value what I was giving. I let out a shaky breath, wiping the tears that threatened to spill. It wasn't about giving up. It was about knowing when I'd reached my limit. For my own sanity, I had to stop waiting for Beatrice's approval. I had to go home. I decided to talk to Barris that afternoon. The air between us was thick, heavy with everything that had been left unsaid. My heart pounded as I stepped forward, determined to finally speak my mind. Beatrice, I began, my voice steady but soft. I need to talk to you. She glanced up briefly, her expression unreadable. If this is about dinner tonight, I'd rather you focus on getting it right than wasting time chatting. My jaw tightened, but I pushed through. No, it's not about dinner. It's about how I've been treated since I got here. Her hand froze mid-stir, and she finally looked at me, one eyebrow arched. Oh? And how exactly have you been treated, Clara? I took a deep breath, the words spilling out before I could second-guess myself. I've been here every day, doing everything I can to take care of you. I've rearranged my life, missed important moments, and given you all of my energy. And yet, no matter what I do, it's never enough. You've made it clear time and time again that you don't value me, and honestly, I'm tired of being treated like I'm worthless. She set her spoon down with a deliberate clink, folding her hands in front of her. Well, she said coolly, if you're tired, Clara, no one's forcing you to stay. Frankly, Emily would do a much better job anyway. She always has. Her words stung, sharper than I'd expected, but I refused to let her see how much they hurt. Emily isn't here, Beatrice, I said, my voice firmer now. She's never here for more than an hour or two. I've been the one taking care of you. But if you think she can do better, then fine. I'm done. Beatrice didn't flinch, her expression hard as stone. Good, she said with disdain. I won't miss the complaining. At least Emily knows how to show respect. I nodded slowly, the finality of her words settling over me like a cold weight. "I hope she can give you what you need," I said quietly, "because I won't be back." Without waiting for her response, I turned and walked away, my chest tight but my head held high. It was over. I was done. Back in the guest room, I packed my things with quiet determination. Each folded piece of clothing felt like another weight lifted off my shoulders. Beatrice's cutting words still rang in my ears, but I shoved them aside. It was over. I was done bending myself into knots for someone who didn't value me. Once everything was packed, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my phone. My thumb hovered over Emily's number before I pressed call. The line rang several times before she finally picked up. "What is it, Clara?" Emily answered, her tone clipped and impatient. "I'm kind of busy right now." I took a deep breath, refusing to let her attitude get to me. "I'm leaving," I said simply. "I've packed my things and I'm heading home. Beatrice needs someone here, so congratulations. You're up." "What?" she snapped, her voice immediately rising. "Wait, what are you talking about? You can't just leave." "I can, and I am," I said firmly. "I've done my part, Emily. It's your turn now." She let out a high-pitched laugh, the kind that came more from disbelief than amusement. "Oh, sure. Just drop everything on me, why don't you? Do you have any idea how busy I am? I can't just—" "I've been here for weeks," I cut in, my voice steady. "You've had time to prepare for this. Mom's your responsibility too, and she seems to think you're better at this anyway. I'm sure you'll figure it out." "Are you kidding me?" Emily shrieked, her tone growing more frantic. "I don't have time to babysit her. That's your thing, Clara. You're the caretaker, not me." "Not anymore," I said, my voice cold. "Good luck, Emily." Before she could respond, I hung up, exhaling a shaky breath. I stood, grabbed my suitcase, and headed for the door. I didn't owe anyone an explanation. It was time to leave. 4 days had passed since I left, and I had tried my best not to think about what might be happening back at Beatrice's house. But when my phone buzzed late that evening, I saw her name flashing on the screen. A part of me wanted to ignore it, but curiosity, and maybe a bit of guilt, got the better of me. I picked up. "Hello?" I said cautiously. "Clara," Beatrice's voice came through, shaky and strained. She sounded different, tired, maybe even desperate. I need to talk to you." I hesitated, unsure of what to say. "Is everything okay?" "No," she admitted, the word heavy with frustration and something else I couldn't quite place. "Emily hasn't been here since you left. She's barely answering my calls, and when she does, she has some excuse about work or being too busy. She promised me she'd be here." I bit my lip, resisting the urge to say I told you so. Instead, I stayed quiet, letting her vent. "I've had to do everything on my own," Beatrice continued, her voice trembling. "I can't even manage the stairs some days. I don't know what to do, Clara. I feel completely abandoned." Her words hit harder than I expected, stirring a mixture of emotions, sympathy, vindication, and a lingering ache of resentment. She had treated me like I was nothing, and now she was realizing what it meant to truly feel alone. "I'm sorry to hear that, Beatrice," I said finally, my tone neutral. "But I warned you this might happen. Emily's good at saying the right things, but she's never been the one to follow through." There was a long pause, and for the first time, Beatrice's voice softened. I didn't think she'd just leave me like this. I thought she cared." I stayed silent, not wanting to twist the knife. Beatrice was finally feeling the consequences of her favoritism, and while a small part of me felt justified, another part of me couldn't help but feel sorry for her. I took a deep breath, clutching the phone tightly. "Beatrice, I'm sorry you're feeling this way. I wouldn't wish this on anyone," I began, my voice quiet but steady. "But I can't just come back. Not right now." "What do you mean, not right now?" she snapped, her tone immediately sharp. I mean, I can't drop everything again to move back in, I said firmly, though my heart ached as I spoke. Beatrice, you treated me like I was nothing when I was there. I gave everything I could, and you made me feel like I didn't matter. I can't put myself through that again. Her response was immediate and furious. Oh, so now you're going to hold a grudge, are you? She yelled, her voice rising. You think you're so perfect, Clara? You think I didn't notice the mistakes you made while you were here? Don't act like you're some martyr. You've never been good enough for this family, and now you're proving it. Her words hit like a slap, but I kept my voice calm. Beatrice, I'm not saying I'm perfect. I know I made mistakes, but I tried. I gave everything I had, and you never saw that. And now, after everything, you expect me to come back as if none of that happened? She let out a bitter laugh, her tone dripping with anger. I should have known. You're just like everyone else, selfish. At least Emily would never abandon me like this. Emily already has, I said quietly, the words hanging in the air. There was a stunned silence on the other end before she exploded again. Don't you dare talk about Emily like that. She has her reasons, unlike you, who's just looking for an excuse to quit. Tears welled in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I'm sorry you feel that way, Beatrice, but I can't come back. Not like this. Before she could yell more, I ended the call, my hands trembling. The weight of her words sat heavy on my chest, but I knew I couldn't go back. Not now, and maybe not ever. 5 days passed, and I tried to move on, pushing the memories of Beatrice's anger to the back of my mind. I was starting to feel a sense of peace again, though it was fragile, held together by long walks and conversations with Ben. Then late in the evening, my phone buzzed. It was her. I stared at the screen for a moment, debating whether to answer. With a deep breath, I picked up. Hello? Clara? Beatrice's voice broke on the other end, shaky and filled with tears. Clara, I'm so sorry. Her sobs were raw, her words tumbling out in fragments. I don't know what to say. I've been sitting here thinking about everything, and I can't believe how awful I was to you. You didn't deserve any of it. I don't even know why I acted like that. You gave so much, and I threw it back in your face. I sat down, stunned. Beatrice, I started, but she cut me off. No, let me finish, she pleaded, her voice trembling. I've been so unfair to you, Clara. So blind. You didn't have to come here, but you did. You took care of me when no one else would. And I treated you so terribly. Her sobs deepened and my chest tightened. I regret it so much, she choked out. Emily hasn't been here in days, and now I see it. I see what you were saying all along. I need you to know how sorry I am. I didn't deserve your kindness, but you gave it anyway. Tears pricked at my eyes, her sincerity cutting through the pain I'd been carrying. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Thank you, Beatrice, I said softly. That means more than you know. I don't expect you to forgive me, she whispered, her voice cracking. But I had to tell you. I'm so sorry. I sat in silence for a moment, letting her words sink in. I'll need time, I said finally, my voice gentle but firm. But I appreciate your apology. It's a start. It is, she said, her sobs quieting. I'll try to do better, Clara. I promise. When the call ended, I set the phone down, my heart heavy but lighter all at once. For the first time, it felt like there was a path forward, however slow it might be. After Beatrice recovered, everything was different. She treated me with kindness and gratitude, her sharp edges replaced by genuine warmth. Each visit was lighter, filled with moments of connection instead of tension. Beatrice went out of her way to show her appreciation, and while the past couldn't be erased, it no longer weighed us down. For the first time, I felt truly valued, and that made all the difference. To Grace! My mom's voice rang out over the room, a beaming smile on her face as she lifted her glass. the one who made this magical day happen. I couldn't have done it without you." I froze in my seat, the words slamming into me like a brick wall. Applause erupted around me, the room filled with laughter and cheers as Grace, sitting just a few seats away, gave a modest little smile and nodded graciously. "My name is Anna Clark. I'm 30 years old, and up until recently, I thought I had a pretty solid relationship with my mom. We used to be close, movie nights, long talks over coffee, a real bond. But everything changed when she started dating her now husband, Mark. Slowly, I felt her pulling away, replacing me with Grace, her new stepdaughter, who was younger, prettier, and seemingly flawless in every way. This wedding, her wedding, was supposed to be my way of reconnecting with her, of proving that I still mattered. I'd spent months planning every detail, silently footing the bill for everything from the venue to the flowers. But it was all a secret, at her insistence, to keep the magic alive. And now, here I was, invisible, as she gave all the credit to someone who barely lifted a finger. The months leading up to the wedding had been a whirlwind of work, stress, and quiet sacrifices. Mom hadn't been involved in the planning at all. That was her decision. "Anna, I don't want to get wrapped up in the stress of it all," she'd said early on. "You're so much better at this kind of thing. Just surprise me, okay? I know you'll make it perfect." Her trust, though flattering, felt strange. She never asked me about the progress, no questions about the flowers, the venue, or even the dress code. It left me confused, but I told myself she was just excited to enjoy the surprise on her big day. I worked tirelessly, managing every detail, from securing the venue to designing the seating chart. I poured my heart into it, convincing myself that this would bring us closer again. What I didn't know, what I only realized too late, was that Grace had been telling Mom a different story. Behind the scenes, Grace had been claiming credit for the entire wedding planning process. I didn't understand why Mom never brought up the preparations to me, why she never seemed curious or concerned about how things were going. Now looking back, the pieces fit. Grace had made sure Mom believed she was the one making it all happen. I didn't see it then, caught up in the work and my hope for the perfect day. I thought Mom's distance was just her way of letting me take the reins. I never imagined it was because she thought someone else was holding them. I remembered a strange conversation I had overheard a few weeks before the wedding. Mom and Grace were sitting in the living room while I was in the kitchen, jotting down notes for the guest list. Their voices carried just loud enough for me to catch snippets. "Oh, Grace, you've been such a lifesaver with all this wedding planning," Mom said, her voice warm and appreciative. "I honestly don't know how I'd have managed without you." Grace laughed lightly, the kind of laugh that grated once you realized how fake it was. "Oh, it's nothing really," she said. "I just want your day to be perfect. You deserve it." My pen froze mid-note, the words making my stomach twist. What was Mom talking about? Grace hadn't been involved in the wedding at all, at least not that I'd seen. But before I could think too much about it, Mom's voice softened further. "I'm so lucky to have a stepdaughter like you," she said. "You're such a natural at this. I thought that Anna was handling it, but you're probably much better than her at it, of course." My throat tightened as I stood there, the conversation echoing in my mind. I wanted to walk in and ask what they were talking about, but I stopped myself. Maybe Mom was just being polite, or maybe Grace was helping in some small way I wasn't aware of. I told myself it didn't matter. But now, sitting here at the reception, her words made all too much sense. Grace had planted those seeds, and Mom had swallowed the narrative whole. The weeks leading up to the wedding were grueling. Every spare moment was consumed by spreadsheets, emails, and endless phone calls. I worked late into the night most days, juggling my regular job with the ever-growing list of wedding tasks. My desk became a chaotic mess of vendor contracts, swatches of fabric for the table linens, and color-coded seating charts. There was the day the florist called to tell me the flowers Mom wanted weren't in season, and I had to scour local suppliers to find a replacement. Then there was the venue mix-up, when the hall booked for the reception accidentally double-scheduled us with a corporate event. I spent hours on the phone smoothing things over, eventually securing the perfect space, though it cost more than I'd budgeted. I coordinated the catering, choosing a menu I knew Mom would love, and even paid extra for a tasting session to make sure it was just right. I handpicked the decorations, spent hours folding and tying ribbons for the chairs, and painstakingly designed the invitations myself to save money. All of this was done in secret, just as Mom had asked. "I want it to be a surprise," she'd said. But the surprise came at a cost. Late nights, skipped meals, and a painful dent in my savings. I had put my whole heart into making it perfect for her, telling myself it was worth it to see her smile on the big day. And now, sitting at the reception, it was clear I'd been invisible the whole time. The sound of a fork tapping against a glass silenced the chatter in the reception hall. I looked up to see Mom standing at the head table, a radiant smile lighting up her face as she held her glass aloft. The room quieted in anticipation. "I just want to take a moment to thank everyone for being here today," she began, her voice warm and filled with emotion. "This day has been a dream come true for me, and I'm so grateful to share it with all of you." Her eyes scanned the room, briefly meeting mine, before moving on. Planning a wedding is no small task, and I have to admit I wasn't involved in much of it. But thankfully, I had someone who stepped in and made this day as perfect as it is. My heart swelled for just a moment, foolishly hoping she meant me. "Grace," Mom continued, her voice brimming with pride, "you've been my rock through this whole process. You've been there every step of the way, making sure every detail was perfect. I couldn't have done this without you." The room erupted into applause, heads turning toward Grace, who gave a bashful smile and waved lightly, like the gracious heroine in some story only she seemed to know. "I'm so lucky to have you as my stepdaughter," Mom said, her voice cracking slightly with emotion. "You've made this day magical, and I'll never forget everything you've done for me." The applause grew louder, and tears pricked at the corners of my eyes as the weight of her words settled in. Not one mention of me, not even a nod in my direction. I sat frozen in my seat, forcing a smile as my chest tightened painfully. Grace beamed under the attention, her eyes flickering to mine for the briefest moment, a subtle smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. I sat there, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, my heart pounding in my chest as the applause for Grace roared around the room. My cheeks burned, and I swallowed hard, willing the tears to stay hidden. This wasn't the time, this wasn't the place. Looking at Mom, glowing with happiness, and Grace, soaking up the admiration, I felt a storm of emotions: anger, sadness, and a gnawing sense of betrayal. But I also knew that saying anything now would only make things worse. This was her day, her wedding. No matter how much it hurt, I couldn't bring myself to ruin it. I forced a smile and joined in the polite clapping, though it felt like my hands weighed a ton. I kept my gaze down and my face neutral, determined not to let anyone see how much I was unraveling inside. I told myself I'd deal with it later, process it, confront it if I had to. But not now. Not here. For the rest of the evening, I stayed quiet, blending into the background as much as possible, waiting for the night to finally end. A week after the wedding, when Mom returned from her honeymoon, I decided I couldn't hold it in any longer. The betrayal had been simmering in my chest, growing heavier with each passing day. I went over to her house and found her unpacking suitcases in the living room, her face still glowing from the vacation. "Mom," I started, my voice sharper than I intended. "We need to talk." She looked up, her smile faltering at my tone. "What is it, Anna? You don't look happy to see me." I crossed my arms, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "What the heck was that? At the wedding? I was the one who did everything for you, and you stood up there and gave all the credit to Grace. She didn't do a single thing." Mom's face hardened, the warmth in her eyes vanishing. "Anna," she said, her voice icy, "I don't know what's gotten into you, but this jealousy of Grace is unbecoming. She worked so hard to make that day special for me. She was the one who actually cared about me." My jaw dropped, my stomach twisting into knots. "Jealousy? Mom, I'm not jealous. Grace lied to you. She didn't plan anything. I did. Every flower arrangement, every table, every vendor, I was the one who made it all happen. Mom let out a dismissive laugh, shaking her head. Stop it, Anna. I asked you to handle the planning, but you clearly didn't care enough to follow through. Grace stepped in because she knew how important this day was to me. She's the one who made it perfect, not you. I stared at her, disbelief flooding through me. She lied to you, Mom. She didn't do anything. She just took credit for all my work, and you believed her without even asking me about it? She crossed her arms, her expression unyielding. Grace wouldn't lie to me, Anna. You're just upset because she outshone you, and frankly, that's on you. Her words hit me like a slap, and I felt the tears rising despite my best efforts to stay composed. You're wrong, I said, my voice trembling. And one day, you'll see that. But she turned away, dismissing me with a wave of her hand. I think you should leave, Anna. I won't stand here and listen to you badmouth Grace. I walked out, my chest aching, the door slamming behind me. Her blind loyalty to Grace stung more than anything I could have imagined. She had chosen Grace's lie over my truth, and I didn't know how, or if I could ever fix that. The next day, I couldn't let it go. The anger and betrayal bubbling inside me pushed me to do what I'd been avoiding. I went to Grace's apartment. When she opened the door, her face lit up with that saccharine smile she always wore, as if she hadn't turned my life upside down. Anna, she chirped, leaning casually against the doorframe. What a surprise. What brings you here? I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. We need to talk, I said, my voice steady but sharp. Sure, come on in, she said with a cheerful tone, stepping aside. I walked past her into the pristine living room, the scent of her overly sweet perfume lingering in the air. I turned to face her, not bothering with pleasantries. What the heck, Grace? Why did you tell my mom that you planned her wedding? Her smile didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Guilt, maybe, or just irritation. What are you talking about? She said, feigning confusion. Don't play dumb, I snapped, my voice rising. You told her you planned the wedding. You let her believe you did everything when it was all me. Do you have any idea how hard I worked? How much I sacrificed to make it perfect? Grace laughed lightly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Anna, I never told her anything like that. She just assumed I was helping. I didn't think it was a big deal, so I didn't correct her. I glared at her, my blood boiling. Didn't correct her? You sat there at the reception and soaked up all the credit. You let her believe it was you while she completely ignored me. She crossed her arms, her smile turning smug. Look, it's not my fault she believes in me more than you. Maybe if you'd been a little more open about what you were doing, this wouldn't have happened. Her words hit like a slap, and I took a step closer, my voice trembling with fury. You're unbelievable. You knew exactly what you were doing, and you didn't care. All you wanted was the spotlight. Grace shrugged, her expression cool and detached. If it means that much to you, talk to her. It's not my problem if she thinks I'm better at these things than you are. I stared at her, disbelief and disgust flooding through me. You're pathetic, Grace, I said, my voice low. And one way or another, the truth is going to come out. Enjoy the spotlight while you can. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. My chest heaved with a mix of anger and resolve. I didn't know how yet, but I was going to make sure everyone knew the truth. Grace wasn't going to get away with this. The day of Grace's birthday arrived, and I sat at home stewing, knowing full well I hadn't been invited. I'd heard from my brother that it was going to be a big celebration. Grace's friends, her boyfriend Liam, and even my mom and the rest of the family would be there. The thought of them all laughing and celebrating while Grace basked in the attention made my blood boil. I stared at the folder on the table in front of me, packed with receipts, email chains, and text messages, every piece of evidence proving that I had been the one to plan and pay for Mom's wedding. Grace's lies had stolen my effort, my recognition, and my relationship with Mom. And I'd had enough. I grabbed the folder, threw on a coat, and headed out the door. I didn't know exactly what I was going to say, but I knew I couldn't let this go on any longer. Before I showed up, the room was buzzing with admiration for Grace. Laughter echoed through the space as her friends and family circled her, their voices overlapping with compliments. "You really outdid yourself with that wedding, Grace," one of her friends gushed, holding a glass of champagne. "Everything was so elegant. It looked like something out of a magazine." Another chimed in, "The floral arrangements were breathtaking. You have such an eye for detail." Even Mom couldn't hold back her adoration. "I don't know how you managed it all," she said, beaming at Grace. "You made it perfect, just like I knew you would." Grace basked in the attention, smiling sweetly and nodding modestly, her eyes glinting with satisfaction as she soaked up the praise for work she hadn't done. When I arrived at Grace's apartment, the party was in full swing. Laughter spilled out into the hallway as I stood at the door, taking one last deep breath before knocking. The noise quieted, and a moment later Grace opened the door. Her smile froze when she saw me. "Anna," she said, her voice tight. "What are you doing here?" "Crashing the party," I said evenly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. The room fell silent as I walked in, all eyes turning toward me. Mom was sitting on the couch, a drink in hand, while Grace's boyfriend Liam stood near the cake, looking confused. "Everyone," I began, my voice loud and steady. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's something I need to say." Grace closed the door and turned to me, her face pale. "Anna, this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," I cut her off, my gaze sweeping the room. "For weeks now, I've been watching someone else take credit for everything I did to plan my mom's wedding. And I think it's time everyone knows the truth." A murmur went through the crowd as I opened the folder and pulled out the first stack of receipts. "I was the one who booked the venue," I said, holding up the contract with my name on it. "I hired the caterers, chose the menu, and paid for every single dish served that night." I moved to the next pile. "I picked out the flowers, organized the centerpieces, and coordinated the delivery times. Here's the invoice and the email chain confirming it." My voice grew stronger as I continued, laying out the text messages, spreadsheets, and more. Everything, the invitations, the decorations, the seating arrangements, was done by me, not Grace. The room was dead silent now, the weight of my words settling over everyone. Mom's face was frozen in shock, and Grace stood stiffly near the door, her jaw clenched. "Anna," Mom finally said, her voice wavering, "what are you talking about? Grace told me." "Grace lied," I said, cutting her off as I turned to face Grace. "Go on, Grace. Tell everyone how you let her believe you did all the work. Tell them how you stood there at the reception and took credit for things you had nothing to do with." Grace's lips parted, but no words came out. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her response. "It's not like that," she stammered, her voice shaky. I didn't lie, I didn't correct her because it wasn't a big deal." "Not a big deal," I said, my voice rising. "You let me work myself to exhaustion while you stood there and soaked up the praise. You didn't care about what that would do to me, or to Mom." Liam stepped forward, his face a mixture of confusion and anger. "Grace," he said slowly, "is this true? Did you lie about planning the wedding?" Grace turned to him, her eyes wide. "Liam, I..." "Don't," he said, holding up a hand. "Just tell me the truth." She looked around the room, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Fine," she said finally, her voice bitter. "Yes, okay? I didn't plan the wedding. Anna did, but it's not like it matters. It was just one day." The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Liam's face hardened, and he took a step back from her. "It matters to me," he said coldly. "If you can lie about something like this, what else are you lying about?" He shook his head, his voice filled with disbelief. "I can't do this anymore, Grace. We're done. Grace's mouth fell open, but no words came out. The color drained from her face as she watched Liam grab his coat and leave. I turned to Mom, who was sitting frozen, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. I tried to tell you, I said softly. I did everything for you, and you wouldn't even listen to me. Anna, she said, her voice breaking, I didn't know. I'm so sorry. I should have asked, It's too late for that, I said, my tone firm but not unkind. I just needed you to know the truth, and now you do. With that, I gathered my things and walked out, leaving the party in stunned silence. For the first time in weeks, I felt free. A couple of days later, the phone buzzed in my hand, and I glanced at the screen, surprised to see Grace's father's name. Mark wasn't the type to call. He was always quiet, keeping to himself at family gatherings. Hesitating for a moment, I answered. Hello? I said cautiously. Anna, his deep voice came through, slow and deliberate. It's Mark. I hope I'm not bothering you. No, it's fine, I replied, unsure of where this was going. What's on your mind? There was a pause, the kind that felt heavy with unspoken words. Finally, he sighed. I just wanted to apologize, he said, his voice thick with shame, for what happened, for what Grace did. My chest tightened, but I kept my voice calm. You don't have to apologize for her, Mark. It wasn't your fault. I know, he said quickly. But still, I feel responsible. I raised her better than that, or at least I thought I did. He paused again, struggling to find the right words. At the party, when I found out what she did, taking credit for all your work, I was ashamed, Anna. Terribly ashamed. You didn't deserve that. I swallowed hard, his sincerity catching me off guard. Thank you for saying that, I said softly. It means a lot. She's paying the price now, Mark continued, his tone somber. I think she's starting to understand the damage she's done. But that doesn't fix what you went through. If there's anything I can do to make it right, anything at all, just say the word. I exhaled, the weight of his words settling over me. I appreciate that, Mark, I said after a moment. I really do. But I think the best thing you can do is talk to Grace. Help her see why this wasn't okay. I will, he said firmly. I promise, Anna. And again, I'm sorry. For all of it. Thank you, I said, my voice steady but filled with gratitude. That means more than you know. In the weeks following Grace's birthday, things shifted. Mom reached out several times, apologizing profusely for not believing me, and for the way she had dismissed my efforts. Her words were filled with regret, and though I accepted her apology, I made it clear that rebuilding trust would take time. Grace, on the other hand, had become a shadow of her former self. The admiration she had once basked in was gone, replaced by awkward silence and judgmental stares from friends and family who now saw her for who she truly was. Liam never came back, and from what I heard, Grace hadn't taken the breakup well. As for me, I felt lighter. For so long, I had sought validation from people who didn't value me, but now I realized I didn't need their approval to feel worthy. I channeled my energy into myself, picking up hobbies I'd neglected, reconnecting with friends, and setting boundaries that protected my peace. Mom and I eventually began to repair our relationship, but it was different now. I no longer bent over backward to prove myself, and she seemed to genuinely respect the space I needed. The distance allowed us to rebuild something healthier, something that wasn't built on my sacrifices. As for Grace, she faded from the center of attention, and I couldn't help but feel a little sorry for her. But only a little. Sometimes, the truth had a way of setting things right, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally move forward. How could you bring this shame on our family, Emma? My dad thundered, his voice filling every corner of the kitchen. He stood at the head of the table, his face lined with disappointment and fury. Eliza leaned casually against the counter, arms folded, her lips pressed into a thin line as she watched the scene unfold. I sat there, stunned, my heart racing, the weight of their judgment suffocating me. My name is Emma Morgan. I'm 26 years old, and tonight my world is unraveling. My father, the only parent I have left, looked at me as though I was a stranger. Eliza, my twin sister, the one who always managed to come out on top, didn't even try to defend me. And now, accused of something I didn't do, I realized I was completely alone. It all started when court orders arrived at my father's house, each one more alarming than the last. They claimed I had defaulted on multiple loans, accounts I had no memory of opening. In the past weeks, I had received some weird calls talking about loans that I was supposed to repay. I dismissed them as scam calls, but the accusations were official, and the weight of the legal threats hung over me like a storm cloud. That's when everything truly fell apart. "I didn't do it, Dad," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "I don't know how this happened, but it wasn't me." Eliza shifted, her eyes glinting as she finally spoke. "Come on, Emma. Are you seriously denying it? Everyone knows your name is on the documents," she said, her voice laced with pity. "Why don't you just tell the truth and stop dragging this out?" My dad's expression hardened as he looked at me. "So what? Are you saying this is all a coincidence? The loans, the complaints, the accusations from people in those places? Why would they target you for no reason?" I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Because someone framed me, Dad. Someone used my name. I don't know how, but I swear to you, I didn't do any of this." My eyes darted to Eliza, who raised her hands in mock surrender. "Framed? Really?" Eliza said, her tone dripping with disbelief. "Who would go through all that trouble, Emma? And why you of all people? This sounds more like an excuse than anything else." Dad shook his head, pacing the room. "Emma, I've always tried to be patient with you, but this is too much. You're not a child anymore. You need to take responsibility for your actions. Until you can, you're not welcome here." The words hit me like a slap, and I felt the ground beneath me shift. "Dad, you're kicking me out?" I whispered. I stood there frozen as my father's words sank in. Eliza sighed dramatically and shook her head. "I hate to see this happen, but maybe some time away will help you reflect, Emma," she said, her voice honeyed with false concern. I looked at her, my throat tightening with anger and disbelief. "You're loving this, aren't you?" I said, my voice low. "You've been the perfect one your whole life, and now you're watching me take the blame for something I didn't do." "Eliza isn't the problem here, Emma," Dad snapped. "You are. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Pack your things and leave tonight." The finality in his tone left no room for argument. My chest ached as I turned away, blinking back tears, knowing that no matter what I said, no one would believe me. I packed my bags in silence, each item a painful reminder of the life I was leaving behind. The walls of my childhood room felt foreign now, as if they belonged to someone else, a version of me that no longer existed. Eliza leaned casually against the doorway, watching me with an unreadable expression. "I wish it didn't have to be this way," she said softly, her tone laced with sympathy that didn't quite feel real. I kept my back to her, shoving clothes into my duffel bag. "Yeah, me too," I muttered, my voice heavy with defeat. "It's just... everything looks so bad right now, Emma. Maybe some time away will help you figure out how this happened," she added. I froze for a moment, gripping the edge of the dresser. "I didn't do this," I said quietly. "I don't know how or why it's happening, but I didn't do it." Eliza sighed, stepping back into the hall. "I hope you figure it out for your sake. Really, I do." Her words echoed in my mind as I zipped up my bag and walked out of the room, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. But for now, all I could do was leave. The night air was cold and sharp as I stepped outside, my duffel slung over one shoulder. The house behind me, once a place of warmth and memories, now loomed like a shadow, filled with accusations and betrayal. I paused at the edge of the driveway, glancing back at the window where the light still glowed faintly. Dad hadn't even come out to see me leave. He'd made his decision and didn't care to look back. Eliza's voice echoed in my head. "I hope you figure it out for your sake." Her words felt hollow, yet they clung to me like a thorn. How had things gotten so twisted? Why was everything pointing to me when I hadn't done anything wrong? As I walked down the street clutching the strap of my bag, I told myself one thing. I might not have answers now, but I wouldn't stop until I found them. Something didn't add up, and I was going to figure it out, even if no one believed me. The bus station was nearly empty when I arrived, the flickering fluorescent lights casting long shadows across the tiled floor. I bought a one-way ticket to the nearest city, my fingers trembling as I handed over the cash. The clerk barely looked at me, sliding the ticket across the counter without a word. I found a seat in the corner, away from the few scattered passengers. The reality of it all began to sink in as I stared at the crumpled ticket in my hand. I was alone now. No home, no family to fall back on. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. How could everything fall apart so quickly? Who would go to such lengths to frame me? And why? The engine of an approaching bus rumbled in the distance, pulling me from my thoughts. As the vehicle rolled to a stop, I tightened my grip on my bag and stood. This wasn't the life I'd envisioned, but it was the one I had to face now, one step at a time. The first few days after leaving home were a blur of cheap motel rooms, instant noodles, and restless nights. I was barely holding it together, my mind spinning with everything I'd lost. But staying in bed and wallowing wasn't going to solve anything. I needed to survive, and that meant finding a job, any job. I landed a position at a small clothing store downtown. It wasn't glamorous, but it was something to keep me busy and bring in a paycheck. My coworker, Mia, was a few years older than me, with bright red hair and a no-nonsense attitude. She didn't pry, but she had a way of getting me to talk without realizing it. One slow afternoon, as we folded shirts near the register, I found myself opening up about what had happened. "It's been a nightmare," I admitted, stacking a pile of sweaters. "I don't even know how my name got dragged into it. I've never done anything like that in my life." Mia paused, leaning against the counter. "That's rough," she said, frowning. "You said it was loans and fraud, right? Did you ever think, I don't know, maybe someone pretending to be you could have done it?" I stopped mid-fold, her words hitting me like a jolt. "Pretending to be me?" I repeated, the idea foreign but oddly plausible. "I mean, I guess it's possible, but who would go to that kind of trouble?" She shrugged, tilting her head. "I don't know. Is there anyone who looks enough like you to pull it off?" Her question hung in the air, heavy with implication. For a moment, I couldn't answer. My mind flickered to the one person who fit that description perfectly. Eliza. But no. Why would she do something like that? Still, the seed of doubt had been planted, and I couldn't shake it. I hesitated, my hands frozen mid-fold. "There's my twin sister," I said slowly, the words tasting strange as they left my mouth. "We're identical, Eliza. But she would never do something like that. Everyone loves her." Mia raised an eyebrow, leaning her elbows on the counter. "A twin? Identical? Emma, come on. If someone's pulling this off, they'd need to look exactly like you. And you're telling me your twin is completely innocent?" I shook my head, the idea twisting my stomach. She's always been the perfect one. My dad trusts her completely. Everyone does. There's no way she'd risk all that for something like this. Besides, why would she frame me? Mia gave a short laugh, the kind that wasn't meant to be funny. "I don't know, jealousy? Spite? You'd be surprised what people are capable of when they think they won't get caught. I mean, who better to impersonate you than someone who looks just like you?" Her words made me uneasy, but they also planted a nagging doubt in my mind. I didn't want to believe it. Couldn't believe it. But the pieces started clicking together in a way I couldn't ignore. What if the person I'd trusted the most had been behind everything all along? That night, I lay awake in my tiny apartment, staring at the cracks on the ceiling. Mia's words echoed in my mind, refusing to let me rest. Who better to impersonate you than someone who looks just like you? Eliza had always been the center of attention, the one who could talk her way out of anything. And me? I was the quiet one, the easy target. But could she really do something so cruel? I pulled out my phone, scrolling through old photos. There we were, Eliza and me, side by side, practically mirror images. I remembered how she used to joke about how easy it would be to trick people. Back then it seemed harmless, just her being playful. But now, it felt like those jokes were hiding something darker. As much as I didn't want to admit it, a part of me couldn't shake the possibility. If it was Eliza, she'd gone to great lengths to make sure I took the fall. And if that was true, I needed proof. I couldn't confront her or anyone else without evidence. This wasn't just about clearing my name anymore. It was about finding the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The next morning, I made a decision. I wouldn't call my dad or Eliza, not yet. If there was even a chance Mia was right, confronting them without proof would only make things worse. Instead, I'd focus on finding answers. At work, I told Mia I wanted to look into it, unsure how she'd react. To my surprise, she grinned and clapped her hands together. Finally, I was wondering if you'd decide to fight back. Let me help, she said, her enthusiasm catching me off guard. You don't have to get involved, I said, nervously twisting a hanger in my hand. Don't be ridiculous, I live for this kind of stuff, Mia replied with a wink. Besides, 2 heads are better than 1, right? Let's start with the basics. Where did these fraud claims come from? Do you have any paperwork or details? I nodded, pulling a folder from my bag. I'd managed to keep copies of the notices that had been sent to my dad's house. Mia scanned through them, her eyes narrowing as she flipped the pages. Most of these are linked to loans and accounts, she said, tapping the papers with her finger. We should check where these were opened. Maybe there's a trail we can follow. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Mia's determination gave me strength, and together, we began piecing together the puzzle. If Eliza or anyone else was behind this, we'd find out. One way or another. It all started when court orders began arriving at my father's house, each one more alarming than the last. They claimed I had defaulted on multiple loans, accounts I had no memory of opening. The accusations were official, and the weight of the legal threats hung over me like a storm cloud. Over the next few days, Mia and I worked tirelessly. During our lunch breaks and after shifts, we sat at her tiny kitchen table, combing through the paperwork and trying to track the accounts. She had a knack for details, noticing things I'd overlooked, like slight variations in handwriting and the locations where the accounts were opened. Look at this, she said one afternoon, sliding a document toward me. The signature here doesn't match yours exactly. It's close, but not identical. And all of these accounts? They were opened in the next city over. I stared at the paper, my heart pounding. Eliza was in that city a couple of years ago. She said it was for a volunteer project. I paused, the words catching in my throat. Do you think... Mia leaned back in her chair, her expression serious. It's starting to look like someone used your name while they were there. And if she was the one spending time in that city, well... She let the sentence hang, the implication heavy. I swallowed hard. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but it's starting to feel like all the roads lead to her. Mia nodded. We'll need more. If she really did this, there'll be a bigger trail. Let's check for any transactions or other records linked to these accounts. Her confidence gave me the push I needed. I wasn't ready to accuse Eliza outright, but the pieces were falling into place. I could feel it. We were getting closer to the truth. The first place on the list was a small credit union on the edge of town. Mia and I stepped inside, the faint smell of paper and stale coffee lingering in the air. A young woman behind the counter glanced up and smiled. "Welcome back," she chirped. I froze. "Excuse me?" The woman's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Oh, sorry. I thought you'd been in here before. You look so familiar." Mia shot me a quick look but said nothing. I forced a smile and approached the counter. "Actually, I'm here about a loan that was opened in my name. I need to understand the details." The woman nodded, typing something into her computer. As her eyes scanned the screen, she frowned slightly. "Yes, I see the account. It was opened 2 years ago. You provided the documents in person, so we'll just need to verify a few details." "In person?" I repeated, my voice shaking. "Yes," she said slowly, her gaze darting between me and the screen. "You brought your ID and signed the forms here in the branch." She hesitated, then added, "It was during a quiet afternoon. I remember because we chatted briefly about how warm it was for that time of year." Mia leaned casually against the counter, her expression calm but her eyes sharp. "Is there any chance you could pull up a copy of those documents? We'd like to check everything carefully." The employee hesitated. "I can't let you take them, but I can show you the scans in the system." She turned the monitor slightly, and there it was. My name, my signature, and my face. Except, it wasn't my face. Not exactly. Mia stepped closer, her voice low. "Emma, that's your sister, isn't it?" My stomach dropped. The face on the screen was identical to mine, but with subtle differences I couldn't deny. It was Eliza. My hands trembled as the truth I'd been avoiding stared back at me. We visited 2 more locations that day, each experience eerily similar. At every bank or loan office, the employees acted like they knew me, greeting me with familiarity or referencing conversations I'd never had. At one office, a middle-aged man behind the desk even chuckled. "Back again? Didn't think we'd see you so soon," he said, shuffling through papers on his desk. I forced a polite smile, my stomach twisting. "Actually, I'm here about some discrepancies with an account opened in my name," I said carefully. His smile faded slightly and he glanced up at me. "You're saying there's an issue? But you provided all the documentation yourself when you were here last month." Mia leaned forward, her tone casual but firm. "Was there any ID involved? Maybe you still have it on file?" The man frowned but nodded. "Of course. Let me pull up the account." When the documents appeared on his screen, my heart sank. The face staring back at me from the ID was unmistakable. Eliza's face wearing my name. My stomach churned as realization hit me like a freight train. It was Eliza all along. The face on the ID, the signature on the forms, the confident way she'd carried out the scams. It was her. My twin sister, my own flesh and blood, had used our identical looks to steal my name, my identity, and leave me to bear the fallout. I stared at the screen in disbelief, my chest tightening with a mix of betrayal and rage. Mia placed a steadying hand on my shoulder, her expression a mix of sympathy and quiet fury. "She's been setting you up from the start," Mia said softly, her words cutting through the silence like a blade. I wanted to scream, to cry, to storm out of the room and demand answers from Eliza. But all I could do was sit there, frozen, as the full weight of what she'd done crashed down on me. My own sister had framed me, and my father had believed her without question. As we left the office, my mind raced, piecing together everything I had ignored or brushed off over the past year. Eliza's sudden obsession with high-end fashion, the designer handbags, the tailored coats, the expensive jewelry she'd flaunted at family dinners. I'd asked her once how she could afford it all, and she'd laughed it off, saying, "Oh, just a little treat for myself. You know I've been saving up." At the time, I believed her. Why wouldn't I? She was always the one who had everything figured out. But now, those memories took on a sinister edge. The way she'd avoided specifics, the extravagant purchases that didn't match her modest job, the smug look she'd get whenever I questioned her success, it all made sense. She hadn't been saving up. She'd been using my name to fund her lavish lifestyle, leaving me to face the consequences. The next day, I met with a lawyer named David Cole. a calm, middle-aged man with a sharp gaze that seemed to see through every word. His office was modest but orderly, with files stacked neatly on his desk and a faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. "I've been notified that I defaulted on multiple loans," I explained, my voice steady despite the nerves bubbling under the surface. "I didn't mean for this to happen, but I need to understand the legal implications if I don't pay, or if I do." David leaned back in his chair, clasping his hands. "If you pay off the defaulted loans, it won't erase the records of the defaults, but it can prevent further legal action, like lawsuits or wage garnishments. However, your credit history will still show the defaults unless the lenders agree to remove them, which isn't guaranteed." I nodded, digesting the information. "And if I don't pay?" "That's a different matter," he said. "The lenders could escalate to lawsuits to recover the funds. If they win, they could seek judgments against you, which might include seizing assets or garnishing wages. It could also hurt your ability to secure credit or loans in the future." His explanation was clear, but it left a sinking feeling in my stomach. Would paying them off at least help clear my name, even if the defaults stay on record? David tilted his head, considering. "It could show good faith, that you're taking responsibility and trying to resolve the issue. But clearing your name entirely would require addressing how the loans came about in the first place. If there's any question of identity theft or fraud, that would need to be investigated." I nodded, my heart pounding. I wasn't ready to bring up Eliza or the possibility of fraud, not yet. For now, I just needed to focus on what could be done, and how much worse things could get if I didn't act. I hesitated for a moment before speaking. What if, hypothetically, someone had stolen my identity and used it to open those loans? Would that change anything? David leaned forward, his sharp gaze narrowing slightly. "If your identity was stolen, that's a serious matter. You wouldn't be legally responsible for the loans, but you'd need to provide evidence to prove you weren't the one who opened them. That typically involves filing a police report, notifying the lenders, and disputing the accounts with the credit bureaus." "And what happens if I can't prove it wasn't me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Then it becomes much more complicated," he replied. "The burden of proof is on you to show you didn't open the accounts. Without that, lenders will continue to treat you as the responsible party. But if you can gather any evidence, like being in a different location at the time or showing discrepancies in the application documents, it can make a big difference." I nodded, his words sinking in like weights on my shoulders. "So paying them off wouldn't clear my name if they think I'm the one who opened the loans?" "Not entirely," David said. "It would stop the legal actions against you for defaulting, but the history of the loans and the assumption that you opened them would remain unless you prove otherwise. If there's even a chance someone else is behind this, you need to investigate it now. The longer you wait, the harder it'll be to gather evidence." I nodded again, my mind racing. His advice made sense, but it also meant I couldn't avoid the truth forever. David's expression softened slightly as he leaned forward, his voice steady. "If you can prove that your identity was stolen and you weren't the one who opened those loans, you won't be held liable for the debts. The lenders will have to close the fraudulent accounts and stop pursuing you. Your credit report can also be corrected to remove the negative marks associated with those accounts." Relief flickered for a moment before another question crept in. "And what happens to the person who stole my identity?" "That depends," David said, his tone firm. "If you provide evidence of identity theft, it becomes a criminal matter. Law enforcement could get involved, and the person responsible could face charges for fraud, forgery, or other related crimes. Penalties could include fines, restitution to the lenders, or even prison time, depending on the severity of the case." I swallowed hard. "So, if I come forward with proof, I'll be cleared, but the person behind this, they could face serious consequences?" "Yes," he said, meeting my eyes. "But clearing your name is your priority. If someone close to you is responsible, I know it might feel complicated. But remember, this isn't just about money. It's about justice and protecting yourself from further harm." I nodded slowly, his words settling heavy in my chest. If it came to that, I'd have to make a choice. protect the person who betrayed me, or finally fight for my own truth. The decision weighed heavily on me, but I knew I couldn't keep running from the truth. Eliza had to face the consequences of what she'd done, not just for me, but for the family she had deceived so easily. I couldn't let her actions ruin my life, but at the same time, the thought of sending her to jail made my stomach churn. That's when the plan formed in my mind. I would confront her, but on my terms. My family used to have a big gathering every year. At the family reunion, with everyone present, I'd lay out the proof of what she did. I wanted her to feel the weight of her betrayal, to see the disappointment in our father's eyes, and to be held accountable for what she'd done to me. But I wouldn't turn her into the authorities, not if she agreed to make it right. Eliza would have to settle the loans she'd taken out in my name. She would fix this mess and take responsibility quietly, without dragging me through further humiliation or legal battles. It was a compromise, one that spared her the worst consequences while giving me the justice I deserved. The family reunion was only a week away. That gave me just enough time to gather everything I needed, every document, every piece of evidence, every fact that would leave no room for her to deny what she'd done. This time, Eliza wouldn't talk her way out of it. She would face the truth, and so would everyone else. The days leading up to the reunion felt like a blur. Every spare moment was spent combing through the evidence I had gathered, photos of the forged documents, bank statements, and even the recordings of the bank employees who had unwittingly confirmed Eliza's actions. Each piece fit together like a puzzle, building an undeniable case against her. Mia was by my side through it all, her relentless energy keeping me focused when the weight of it all threatened to crush me. "You've got this, Emma," she said as I packed the files into a neat folder the night before the reunion. "Just stick to the plan. Don't let her twist this around." I nodded, my hands trembling slightly as I zipped the folder shut. "She's been doing this for so long, Mia. What if no one believes me? What if Dad sides with her again?" Mia placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "This time, you're not just speaking your truth, you're showing it. They can't argue with facts, Emma. You've done everything you can. Now it's time to let the truth do the rest." Her words stayed with me as I went to bed that night, my nerves tangled with anticipation. Tomorrow, everything would change, one way or another. The moment I stepped through the door, a wave of cold stares hit me like a slap to the face. Conversations halted mid-sentence, heads turned, and I felt the weight of 50 pairs of judgmental eyes boring into me. My heart pounded, but I straightened my shoulders and walked further into the room, refusing to let their disgust break me. Whispers followed me as I passed. "Can you believe she had the nerve to show up? After everything she's done? Unbelievable." I heard she's being taken to court. The room was packed, with relatives I hadn't seen in years filling the space. My dad stood near the fireplace, talking to Uncle Richard, but when he saw me, his face darkened. Eliza, ever the actress, stood near the buffet table, surrounded by a group of cousins who hung on her every word. She glanced at me, her eyes narrowing slightly, but her expression quickly shifted into one of practiced pity. "Emma," Dad called, his voice clipped and cold. "I'm surprised you even showed up." I forced a polite smile and held my ground. "Of course I showed up. It's a family reunion, isn't it?" The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Eliza sauntered over, a drink in her hand, her voice dripping with condescension. "It's brave of you to come here after everything that's been going on," she said sweetly. "I know things have been difficult for you lately." I clenched my fists at my sides, my folder tucked securely under my arm. "You have no idea, Eliza. But that's why I'm here. I have something to say, and I think everyone here deserves to hear it." The room went silent as her smirk faltered slightly, replaced by a flicker of unease. This time, I wasn't going to let her control the narrative. This time, the truth would speak for itself. I stepped forward, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear myself think. The room fell into an uneasy hush, all eyes glued to me. I could see the disbelief, the anger, the pity in their faces. but I focused on Eliza. Her smug confidence was still there, but I noticed the faintest flicker of tension in her eyes. She knew something was coming. I began, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. I know many of you have heard things about me recently, things that make me look like a liar and a thief. I've been accused of defaulting on loans I never took and ruining the family's reputation. It's hurt me deeply to think that so many of you believe I could do something like that. I paused, scanning the room, letting the silence settle. Eliza shifted slightly, her smile thinning. But I didn't come here to plead my innocence with words alone. I came here with proof. I pulled the folder from under my arm and held it up. Everything I'm about to show you is documented and verifiable. Bank statements, witness testimonies, even recordings from the places where these loans were supposedly taken out. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and I opened the folder, holding up the first document, a scan of the loan application with Eliza's forged signature and photo. This is the application for one of the loans. The signature isn't mine. The photo ID, though it uses my name, isn't me. It's her. I pointed directly at Eliza. Gasps echoed through the room, and her confident facade cracked for just a moment before she quickly recovered. "That's ridiculous," she said, her voice rising as she laughed nervously. "Why would I ever do something like that? Emma, this is desperate, even for you." But I didn't stop. I laid out every piece of evidence, the mismatched handwriting, the dates she'd been in the cities where the loans were taken out, the employees' descriptions of her. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together, and the crowd turned their eyes to Eliza, their expressions shifting from pity for me to suspicion toward her. By the time I finished, the room was buzzing with tension. I looked directly at my father, his face pale, his eyes darting between me and Eliza. "Dad," I said, my voice softer now. "I know you don't want to believe this, but the truth is right here. She used my name, my identity, to fund her lifestyle, and I've been left to pick up the pieces." Eliza stepped forward, her voice shrill. "This is insane. She's lying, trying to turn everyone against me because she's jealous. You all know she's always been jealous of me." But the weight of the evidence spoke louder than her words, and for the first time, I saw doubt flicker in the eyes of those who had always believed her. The room was filled with stunned silence as I finished speaking, my evidence laid bare for all to see. Faces that once held disgust and judgment now showed shock and disbelief, their gazes shifting from me to Eliza with growing unease. Whispers spread like wildfire, and I could see the shift, slow at first, but undeniable. They believed me. For the first time, the weight of their judgment lifted, replaced by the crushing realization of what Eliza had done. Eliza's face twisted with anger as the whispers grew louder, the weight of the evidence pressing down on her. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice sharp and trembling. "I don't have to stand here and listen to these lies." She shoved past the crowd, her heels clicking furiously against the floor as she stormed toward the door. "You're all pathetic for believing her," she shouted over her shoulder before disappearing into the night, leaving the room in stunned silence. As soon as the door slammed shut behind Eliza, the room erupted into a mix of murmurs and hesitant apologies. A few relatives approached me, their voices soft, laden with guilt. "I'm so sorry, Emma," one cousin said, her eyes welling with tears. "We had no idea." But I couldn't stay to listen. My heart raced as I turned and followed Eliza, pushing past the crowd. I needed to confront her, alone. "Emma, wait," my dad's voice called after me. I hesitated for a moment, then kept going. I heard his footsteps behind me as I stepped into the cool night air, scanning the parking lot for Eliza. There she was, fumbling with her car keys, her hands shaking as she tried to unlock the door. "Eliza," I shouted, my voice echoing in the quiet lot. She froze, then turned to face me, her expression a mix of fury and panic. My dad caught up, his breath ragged, and looked between the two of us, confusion and anger etched on his face. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his voice breaking the tense silence. I stepped forward, my eyes locked on Eliza. "You're not running away from this," We need to talk. Right now. Eliza's eyes darted between me and our dad, her panic barely concealed beneath her defiant glare. She crossed her arms, leaning against the car as if she could shield herself from what was coming. "Admit it, Eliza," I said, my voice steady but firm. "Tell Dad the truth about what you did, or I'll have no choice but to take this to the authorities." Her jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought she might lash out. But the weight of the situation was pressing down on her, and she knew it. "Eliza," Dad said, his voice shaking, filled with anger and desperation, "is what Emma's saying true? Did you really do this?" Eliza scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Fine," she snapped, throwing up her hands. "Yes, I did it, okay? I used her name for the loans. I didn't think it would get this far. I figured it'd all blow over and no one would even notice." Dad staggered back a step, his face pale. "How could you, to your own sister? To this family?" "I didn't think she'd be such a martyr about it," Eliza shot back, her voice cracking. "I needed the money, and she's always been flying under the radar. I thought she'd just take the heat and move on." I shook my head, my heart pounding. "You didn't just hurt me, Eliza, you destroyed my life, and I was ready to let you get away with it if you'd just own up to it and fix it. But if you don't settle those loans and clear my name, I'll make sure everyone knows what you've done, including the police." Eliza froze, the weight of my ultimatum hanging heavy in the air. For once, she had no comeback, no way to charm her way out of the mess she'd created. Eliza's defiance crumbled, her shoulders sagging as tears welled in her eyes. She looked down at the ground, unable to meet either of our gazes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never meant for it to get this bad. I didn't think it through." Dad stared at her, his expression a mix of disappointment and disbelief. "You didn't think? Eliza, do you realize what you've done to your sister, to this family?" She wiped at her eyes, shaking her head. "I'll fix it," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "I'll pay back everything. I'll settle the loans. I'll clear Emma's name. I swear I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." I watched her carefully, searching for any hint of manipulation, but for the first time, Eliza looked genuinely ashamed. "You better mean that," I said, my voice firm but quieter now. "Because if you don't, I won't hesitate to take the next step. This is your last chance, Eliza." She nodded frantically. "I do. I'll do it, Emma. I promise." Over the next few weeks, Eliza kept her word. She contacted the banks, paid off the defaulted loans, and provided statements clearing me of any involvement. It wasn't an easy process, and it didn't erase the damage overnight, but step by step, my name was restored. While I couldn't forget what she'd done, I felt a sense of closure. In the end, justice was served, not through revenge, but through accountability. Eliza's actions left scars, but they also gave me the strength to stand up for myself and reclaim my life. My family began to see me for who I truly was, not the person they had unfairly judged. Though trust with Eliza would take time, I found peace in knowing I had finally stepped out of her shadow and into my own light. "You're such a saint, Sarah," my mom gushed, her voice practically dripping with pride. "We don't know what we'd do without you." I stayed quiet, my fork hovering over my plate, while Sarah, sitting across from me, smiled that picture-perfect, self-satisfied grin she wore so well. She didn't even glance in my direction, like she knew I wouldn't say anything. Like I couldn't say anything. "My name is Julia Mitchell. I'm 27 years old, and I'm an elementary school teacher. For as long as I can remember, I've been the one who picks up the pieces in this family, but no one ever notices. My older sister, Sarah, has always been the golden child, the charming, charismatic one. Me? I'm the dependable one, the one who quietly steps in when things fall apart. For years, I've been sending money to my parents to help with their medical bills, making sacrifices while Sarah soaks up all the credit. But recently, I decided I'd had enough. And now, the fallout has started. I remember the day I made the decision to stop sending money like it was yesterday. It wasn't planned, no grand gesture. I was sitting in my tiny apartment, staring at the numbers on my bank account after paying rent, and something inside me just snapped. I realized I couldn't keep living like this, barely scraping by while Sarah played the hero. I never told anyone. I just stopped. At first, nothing happened. Weeks passed, and I waited for someone to notice, to say something. But everything stayed quiet, and for a moment, I wondered if maybe they had figured it out, that Sarah wasn't actually footing the bills like they believed. Then the calls started. My mom asking why certain payments were late, my dad mentioning a few overdue notices they'd received. Sarah, of course, stayed silent, probably hoping no one would put two and two together. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The breaking point came one Sunday afternoon when my mom called me, her voice tight with frustration. "Julia, your dad's insurance payment is overdue again. Did something happen to Sarah's account? She said she's been handling everything, but things keep slipping through the cracks." My chest tightened as I gripped the phone. It was the first time I'd heard even a hint of doubt in my mom's voice about Sarah. I wanted to scream, "It's not Sarah! It's been me this whole time." But I didn't. Instead, I swallowed the lump in my throat and said, "Maybe you should ask Sarah directly." It felt like a small rebellion, not giving them the answers they wanted, letting the truth simmer instead of throwing it in their faces. For once, I wanted them to figure it out on their own. Still, the guilt gnawed at me every time my parents sounded stressed or confused. I hated feeling responsible, even though deep down I knew I wasn't. As the weeks dragged on, things started to unravel. My mom called more often, sounding more anxious each time. Sarah said she's trying to work it out, but the hospital keeps sending these notices. "Your father can't miss his treatments, Julia," she snapped one evening. Meanwhile, Sarah's Instagram painted a different picture. Photos of her sipping cocktails on rooftop bars and unboxing expensive skincare products. I couldn't believe it. She was still acting like nothing was wrong, like she wasn't the reason our parents were struggling. Then came the family dinner. My mom insisted we all get together to talk things through. I knew what that meant. She'd call on Sarah to explain the situation, and I'd sit there, the invisible daughter, nodding along while Sarah spun some story. But this time, things didn't go as planned. My dad, usually the quiet one, looked Sarah dead in the eye and said, "You've been handling this for months, Sarah. What's going on? Why can't you keep up with the payments?" The color drained from her face, and for once I saw a crack in her perfect facade. Sarah stammered, something about unexpected expenses and a temporary hiccup, but it was clear she hadn't prepared for this. My mom jumped in, her tone sharp as ever. "She's doing her best, Robert. Why don't you lay off her and Julia?" she said, turning her gaze to me. "Maybe it's time you step up and help for once. You don't do anything for us as it is." I felt the words hit me like a slap. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, the sheer unfairness of it making my chest ache. I looked at Sarah, who refused to meet my eyes, and then back at my mom, whose expression was filled with disappointment, directed at me, of course. My dad stayed silent, like always, and I realized they genuinely believed it. They believed Sarah had been carrying this burden all along, and I was just some selfish bystander. My hands were shaking, but I managed to say, "That's not true, Mom. I've been helping. I've been the one paying those bills for years." The room fell silent, the tension so thick it felt like the walls were closing in. My mom broke it with a scoff, shaking her head. "Julia, don't be ridiculous. Sarah is the one paying for everything. She's been working so hard to keep us afloat. You've done nothing to help us, and now you're trying to take credit for her sacrifices?" My stomach churned, and my hands gripped the edge of the table to keep steady. I glanced at Sarah, who sat there like a statue, her face frozen in an expression that was part shock, part guilt. She wasn't even trying to defend herself. The words spilled out before I could stop them. "That's not true, Mom. It's never been true. For 3 years, I've been sending money to cover those bills. Every month. Sarah hasn't paid for a single thing." My voice cracked, but I forced myself to keep going. "And you know what? I stopped because I was tired of being invisible while she took all the credit. Sarah's head snapped up, her face twisted with disbelief. What is wrong with you, Julia? Why are you making up these lies? She said, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. This is insane. I've been the one helping Mom and Dad all along, and now you're trying to make me look bad? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Are you seriously going to sit there and pretend I'm lying? Sarah, I have bank statements, receipts, 3 years of them. Do you want me to show everyone right now? Receipts? She repeated with a mocking laugh. What receipts, Julia? You're just bitter because Mom and Dad appreciate what I do for them. You've been sitting on the sidelines while I've been keeping this family together, and now you want to swoop in and rewrite history? Rewriting history? I shot back, my voice rising. You've been stealing credit for everything I've done, Sarah. I'm the one who's been sending money month after month while you've been spending your paychecks on spa days and luxury vacations. Sarah crossed her arms, her eyes darting toward our mom. You see, Mom, this is what I'm talking about. Julia always plays the victim. She's just trying to tear me down because she can't stand that I actually help you. Her words were dripping with fake hurt, but I noticed how her voice cracked, just slightly, at the end. Sarah's voice shot across the table, sharp and accusing. If you were really helping Julia, why the heck didn't you say a word for 3 years? And now, suddenly, you're bringing this up. Let me guess. You wouldn't have said anything if it weren't for the credit. Admit it. You're just mad because I'm the one they thank. It doesn't make sense otherwise. My mom folded her arms, nodding in agreement. Sarah's right, Julia. Why wouldn't you tell us sooner if you were helping all this time? You expect us to believe this now, after all these years. It feels strange, Julia. It really does. I felt the heat rising in my cheeks, my frustration boiling over. Because I wasn't doing it for the credit, I said, my voice trembling. I did it because I wanted to help you. I didn't think I needed to parade it around for validation. And yes, maybe I should have spoken up earlier, but why does that make it okay for Sarah to take credit for something she didn't do? Sarah rolled her eyes dramatically. Oh, please, Julia. You're acting like I forced you into silence or something. If this is even true, which I doubt, why wait until now to throw it in everyone's face? Because you're bitter, that's why. This has nothing to do with helping and everything to do with you trying to make me look bad. My dad shook his head slightly, his voice calm but questioning. Julia, it's hard to understand why you'd keep quiet all this time if it's really true. I just don't get it. Their doubt was crushing, and Sarah's smug expression only made it worse. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady as I turned to face Sarah directly. I didn't say anything because I was happy to help Mom and Dad, I said firmly. I didn't need the recognition. I was doing it for them, not for anyone's approval. But when I realized what you were doing, taking credit for my sacrifices, I couldn't believe it. So I decided to wait, to see just how long you'd keep up the lie. Sarah's face flushed with anger, but she didn't back down. That's ridiculous, she snapped, her voice rising. You're saying you let me take the credit, just sat there silently for years, and now you're trying to flip this on me? You could have stopped it at any time, Julia. But no, you waited until now, conveniently, when you think you can humiliate me. I waited, I said, cutting her off, because I wanted to see if you'd ever own up to it, if you'd ever have the decency to admit the truth on your own. But you didn't, Sarah. You just kept letting everyone believe your story while I worked myself to the bone. I turned to my parents, who looked stunned, their expressions a mix of doubt and confusion. I didn't want this fight, but I'm not going to let her rewrite history anymore. I straightened in my chair, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. I have all the receipts, Mom. Every bank statement, every proof of payment for the past 3 years. It would take me less than 5 minutes to pull them up and show you, but that's not the point. I turned to Sarah, locking eyes with her. What I want is for you to admit what you've been doing. Just be honest for once. Sarah crossed her arms, her face hardening into a mask of defiance. I don't know what you're talking about, she said coolly, though her voice wavered just slightly. I've been the one handling things. If you have proof, then show it, Julia. Otherwise, stop making up these stories to make me look bad. The audacity of her words made my blood boil, but I stayed calm. Why should I have to show it, Sarah? You already know the truth. If you had any integrity, you'd admit it yourself instead of digging yourself into a deeper hole. My dad leaned forward, his face pale, but my mom still looked at me with suspicion, as if she couldn't decide who to believe. And Sarah? She just sat there, her jaw clenched, refusing to back down. It was infuriating. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor, and stood up. My voice was shaking, but I kept it firm. I'm done, Sarah. If you're so determined to keep lying, then I have nothing more to say to you. I won't waste my energy trying to get you to admit what we both know is true. I turned to Sarah one last time, my heart heavy but resolute. If there's even a shred of a decent person left inside you, you'll tell Mom and Dad the truth. Until then, don't expect me to answer your calls or texts. I'm done with you. She scoffed, crossing her arms. Oh, don't be so dramatic, Julia. This is ridiculous. Her words stung, but I refused to let her see it. Without another glance, I grabbed my coat and walked out the door, leaving them all behind. For the first time, I felt like I was finally choosing myself over their endless expectations. It would have been easy to prove it. Pulling out my phone and showing the bank statements would have taken seconds. But that wasn't the point. For me, it was about more than just proving who was right. I wanted Sarah to own up to what she'd done, to finally take responsibility for lying to all of us for so long. Months went by, and the silence between me and my parents grew heavier with each passing day. Our conversations became surface level, strained and short, like they didn't know how to talk to me anymore, or maybe they just didn't want to. I didn't blame them entirely. I knew I'd shattered the image they'd built around Sarah, and they weren't ready to face it. But it still hurt. As for Sarah, I didn't speak to her at all. Not a single text, call, or interaction. I avoided every family gathering where I knew she'd be, even skipping Mom's birthday dinner. I couldn't sit in the same room with her and pretend everything was fine while she kept up the act. It wasn't worth the anger or the exhaustion it brought. My only focus now was on rebuilding my peace. It didn't take long for the cracks in Sarah's perfect facade to show. Word got around that she was struggling financially, missed payments on her car, cutting back on her flashy outings, and even a few not-so-subtle posts on social media about tight budgets and unexpected expenses. It didn't take a genius to figure out why. She had to start making the payments herself to keep up the lie. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for her, but I couldn't. This was the mess she created, and now she had to live with it. I'd sacrificed for years without complaint, and she'd reaped the benefits. Watching her squirm, knowing she was finally feeling the weight of the responsibility she claimed to have all along, was a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. It wasn't how I wanted things to be, but it was exactly what she deserved. It was a Saturday afternoon when Sarah showed up at my door, unannounced. I almost didn't recognize her. She looked exhausted, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, and her usual polished demeanor nowhere to be found. For a moment, I just stared, unsure if I should let her in or send her right back down the hallway. "Can we talk?" she said, her voice quiet, almost pleading. It wasn't the Sarah I was used to, and that threw me off. Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let her in, motioning to the couch. She sat down heavily, as if the weight of the world had finally caught up with her. I stayed standing, arms crossed, waiting for her to speak. I'm in trouble, Julia," she started, her voice breaking slightly. "I can't keep up with everything anymore. I don't know what to do." I leaned against the wall, keeping my arms crossed, and stared at her. "That's not my problem, Sarah," I said flatly. I could see her flinch, but I didn't feel an ounce of guilt, not after everything she'd done. "You made this bed. Now you get to lie in it." Her eyes widened, and for the first time I saw real panic behind them. "Julia, please. I know I messed up, but I cut her off, my voice sharper than I intended. Messed up? Sarah, you lied. You lied to our parents, to everyone, and you let me carry the weight while you played the hero. And now what? You want me to swoop in and save you? No. I'm not doing it. I'm done. Sarah's voice cracked as she pleaded, Please, Julia, I just need a little help. Things are really bad right now, and I don't have anyone else to turn to. She wiped at her face, her hands trembling. I know I haven't been fair to you, but you're my sister. I stared at her, feeling a strange mix of anger and pity. Help? I repeated, my voice cold. You're asking me for help? After everything you've done? She nodded quickly, her eyes red and swollen. I know I screwed up, okay? But I'm trying, Julia. I'm trying to make things right. I let out a bitter laugh. Make things right? Sarah, you've been lying to my face for years. You want my help? Start by telling Mom and Dad the truth. Until you're willing to do that, I've got nothing for you. Her silence was deafening, and I could see her struggling to come up with something, anything to say. But she didn't. She just looked down, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Sarah straightened up, her voice defensive now. Look, Julia, I've been making the payments, okay? So technically, I'm not lying anymore. I've been handling it, just like everyone thinks I have. I felt my face heat up, my anger bubbling over. Technically, I repeated, my voice rising. Do you even hear yourself, Sarah? You're not lying anymore? You've been lying for years, letting everyone think you were some kind of savior while I was breaking my back to help. And now you think doing the bare minimum makes it okay? Her jaw tightened, and she looked away, avoiding my glare. I'm doing my best, Julia, she muttered. I didn't mean for it to get this far. That's the problem, Sarah, I snapped. You never meant for anything, but you're perfectly fine letting me take the fall so you can keep your perfect little image intact. You're not doing this for them. You're doing it for yourself. Don't act like this makes up for anything. My hands were shaking, but I refused to let her see how much it hurt. Sarah looked up at me, her voice trembling but determined. Okay, fine. I'll tell Mom and Dad the truth. I'll admit everything. But I need your help first, Julia. Please, just this once. I stared at her, stunned by the audacity. You're kidding me, right? I said, my tone icy. You're asking me to help you clean up the mess you made and then you'll think about telling the truth? How convenient. Her eyes widened and she shook her head quickly. No, I swear. I'll do it. I'll tell them everything, I promise. But I'm drowning here, Julia. I just need a little help to get through this, and then I'll come clean, I swear. I let out a bitter laugh, crossing my arms. So let me get this straight. You're willing to keep lying to Mom and Dad unless I bail you out? And you expect me to believe you'll actually follow through this time? She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up a hand to stop her. No, Sarah. I'm not playing this game with you anymore. If you want to fix this, you don't need my help. You need to tell the truth. Period. Sarah took a deep breath, her voice steadier now. Fine. I'll do it. I'll tell the entire family the truth at the reunion next Saturday. Everything. I'll admit it all. She looked at me, her eyes desperate. Will that be enough for you? I paused, an idea forming in the back of my mind. You're going to confess everything? I asked, narrowing my eyes. Yes, she said firmly, nodding. I'll tell them the whole truth, Julia. I swear. I let the silence stretch for a moment, then nodded. All right. If you do it, if you actually stand up in front of the entire family and tell them what you've done, I'll give you the money on Sunday, but only if you go through with it. Sarah hesitated, then nodded quickly, her relief almost palpable. I didn't smile, didn't soften. I just hoped she didn't realize what I was really going to do. The family reunion was in full swing when Sarah stood up, tapping her glass to get everyone's attention. I watched her closely, my arms crossed as I leaned against the wall, not trusting a single word until it actually left her mouth. She cleared her throat, her face pale, but her voice carried over the room. "I have something I need to say." Everyone quieted down, the usual hum of chatter replaced with curious glances. My mom looked up expectantly, and my dad furrowed his brows, already sensing something was off. Sarah took a deep breath, gripping the edge of her chair like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "For the past few years, everyone has thought I was the one helping Mom and Dad with their bills," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "But that wasn't true. It wasn't me. It was Julia." The room fell silent, stunned faces staring back at her. My mom blinked, her mouth opening and closing, trying to process what she'd just heard. My dad was the first to speak, his voice thick with disbelief. "Wait, what are you saying, Sarah?" "I'm saying that Julia was the one sending the money all this time," Sarah admitted, her voice cracking. "And I let you think it was me. I lied." Her shoulders slumped as if the weight of her words had finally crushed her. "I'm sorry." My mom's face crumpled as she looked at me, tears welling in her eyes. "Julia, we didn't believe you. We called you a liar." She shook her head, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. How could we not see it?" My dad stood crossing the room to me, his face full of guilt. "Julia, I don't even know what to say. We were wrong about everything. You didn't deserve any of this." Their apologies were genuine, but all I could do was nod. I'd waited so long to hear those words, but in that moment, they didn't feel as satisfying as I thought they would. I wasn't doing this for them. I was doing it for me. My mom couldn't stop apologizing, her voice trembling as she reached out to touch my arm. "Julia, we've been so blind. I don't know how we didn't see it. I don't know how we could have been so unfair to you." My dad nodded, his eyes filled with guilt. "We're sorry, Julia, truly. You've done so much for us, and we failed you. I don't know how we can make it up to you, but I hope you'll give us the chance to try." I looked at both of them, their remorse so raw it was almost overwhelming. For the first time, I saw how much my silence had shielded them from the truth, and how much my decision to let them believe Sarah's lies had cost me. "I appreciate your apology," I said softly, my voice steady. "But this isn't something we can fix overnight. I need time, and I need space. I need to focus on myself for now." My mom wiped at her tears, nodding quickly. "We understand, sweetheart, please don't shut us out. We want to do better." I gave her a small, tired smile and glanced at Sarah, who hadn't moved from her seat, her head bowed in silence. I didn't say another word to her. Instead, I grabbed my coat and walked out of the house, leaving the reunion and all its weight behind. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally putting myself first. As I walked out the door, I didn't look back, and I didn't spare Sarah a single glance. Whatever happened between her and my parents after I left wasn't my concern anymore. For once, I wasn't going to carry their problems on my shoulders. Sunday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. I didn't need to open it to know what it was about. Sure enough, when I checked, there it was. "I told them the truth, Julia. Now can you send me the money we talked about?" I stared at the screen for a moment, feeling a pang of something. Anger? Pity? Maybe both. It didn't take her long to come knocking, did it? I took a deep breath, knowing exactly how I was going to respond. I replied calmly, "Meet me at Mom and Dad's house. Let's talk there." I didn't give any further details and left it at that. By the time Sarah showed up, I was already sitting in the living room with our parents. Their expressions were somber, a mixture of disappointment and sadness that made the air in the room feel heavy. Sarah walked in, her eyes flicking between us, her confident facade faltering. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice shaky. I held up my phone and showed her the message she sent me. "I thought it was time Mom and Dad saw this," I said evenly. "So they'd know that the only reason you finally told the truth yesterday was because you needed money from me." My voice didn't waver. I wanted her to feel the full weight of what she'd done. Mom's face turned red and Dad sighed, rubbing his temples as the reality sank in. "I'm not giving you the money, Sarah," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Telling the truth was something you should have done a long time ago. Not because you needed something from me, but because it was the right thing to do. I'm not going to reward you for finally doing the bare minimum after all these years." I stood up, grabbing my bag as Sarah's face crumpled. She dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Please, Julia," she sobbed, clutching at my arm. "I'm begging you. I don't know what else to do." I pulled my arm free, looking down at her one last time. "That's not my problem anymore, Sarah," I said, my voice cold. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the house, her cries echoing behind me as I closed the door. For the first time, I felt no guilt, just relief. As I walked away from the house, the weight I'd carried for years finally lifted. I didn't feel anger or regret, just a quiet sense of freedom. For once, I wasn't the one cleaning up the mess. It was time to focus on my own life, leaving Sarah and the past exactly where they belonged, behind me. "You've got to be kidding me," my mom said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Madison is the one who's always thinking of us. Why would you try to take that away from her?" I sat there, my mouth slightly open, while Madison, perched confidently on the edge of the couch, gave me a smug little smile that made my stomach churn. "My name is Samantha Myers. I'm 29 years old and I work as a marketing consultant. To most people, I'm the reliable, level-headed one in the family, the one who gets things done without needing applause. That's why, a few months ago, I decided to leave $10,000 in my parents' mailbox as an anonymous gift, just to make their lives a little easier. The only person I told was my younger sister, Madison, a struggling artist who's always been the center of attention. I never imagined she'd turn around and claim the gift as her own, basking in the praise of my parents and everyone else. At first, I didn't say anything. I figured it wasn't worth the fight, and maybe, just maybe, Madison would come clean on her own. But weeks turned into months, and every time we had a family dinner, my parents would gush about how generous Madison was, how lucky they were to have a daughter like her. The more they praised her, the angrier I got. It wasn't about the recognition. It was the fact that she let them believe a lie while I sat there biting my tongue. The worst part? I couldn't even prove it. I hadn't thought it through when I left the money. I just stuffed $10,000 in cash into an envelope and dropped it into their mailbox. No cameras, no notes, no traceable bank transactions, nothing. It was supposed to be anonymous after all. I never imagined I'd need to prove that it was me. So, when I finally snapped at Sunday dinner and said, "Actually, I'm the one who left the money," the room went dead silent. Every eye turned to me, filled with disbelief. And Madison? She just sat there, her face a perfect mask of shock, as if she was the one being accused. My mom was the first to speak, her voice sharp and defensive. "Samantha, that's ridiculous. Why would you say something like that? We all know it was Madison. She's been so thoughtful, and we're so grateful for her help." My dad nodded along, looking at me like I'd just said the most absurd thing he'd ever heard. "There's no reason to make this into a competition," he added, his tone disappointingly dismissive. "Madison, of course, played the part perfectly. I can't believe you'd try to do this, Sam," she said, her voice trembling as if she was genuinely hurt. "I mean, I know things have been tense between us, but this? Really?" She glanced at our parents for support, and they were quick to jump in, reassuring her, while I sat there in disbelief. It was maddening. She wasn't just lying, she was doubling down on it, and everyone was eating it up. I clenched my fists under the table, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm not trying to start a competition," I said, my eyes locked on Madison. "I just want the truth out there. I was the one who left the money in the mailbox. You're taking credit for something you didn't do, and it's not right." Madison shook her head, her expression a mix of disbelief and pity, like she couldn't believe I'd stoop so low. "You don't even have proof, Sam," she said, her voice soft and condescending. Why would you leave cash like that? That doesn't sound like something you'd do. And honestly, it feels like you're just trying to ruin this for me because you're jealous." The words stung, and I could see my mom frowning as if Madison had a point. I realized then that no matter what I said, they were too wrapped up in their image of her to even consider the possibility that I was telling the truth. My mom sighed deeply, shaking her head as if she was dealing with a child throwing a tantrum. "Samantha, this jealousy is getting ridiculous. Madison has always been so thoughtful, and instead of being happy for what she's done for us, you're trying to tear her down? It's really disappointing." My dad chimed in, his tone annoyingly patronizing. "We love you, Samantha. Even if you didn't give us money, you don't have to compete with your sister for our attention." He gave me a pitying smile, like he was doing me a favor by forgiving me for something I hadn't even done. Meanwhile, Madison sat there, looking hurt but smug, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The whole thing felt surreal, like I'd been thrown into a bad sitcom where the truth didn't matter. I couldn't take it anymore. The disbelief, the condescension, the smug look on Madison's face. I'd had enough. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor, and glared at all three of them. "You know what? You're being absolutely ridiculous," I said, my voice sharp and unsteady from holding back everything I'd been feeling. "You're so busy fawning over Madison that you can't even consider the possibility that she's lying. But one day, you're going to realize the truth, and it'll be too late." I turned to Madison, who was still sitting there, looking like the innocent victim. "And you," I said, pointing a finger at her. "One day you're going to regret what you've done. Maybe not now, but when you need someone to trust, someone to lean on, you'll realize you've burned the only bridge that mattered." I didn't wait for their response. I grabbed my things and walked out, slamming the door behind me. I wasn't going to sit there and let them paint me as the jealous liar anymore. In the weeks that followed, everything changed. My relationship with my parents became painfully cold. The usual texts and calls dwindled to almost nothing. And when we did talk, it was distant, like we were strangers navigating polite conversation. Madison? I didn't hear from her at all, and honestly, I didn't want to. Every family event or gathering, I found some excuse to skip. The thought of sitting in the same room with her, pretending like nothing had happened, was unbearable. The only person I could lean on was Katie, my best friend. One night, over a bottle of wine at her apartment, I finally let it all out. "I don't know what hurts more," I said, my voice cracking. "That Madison could do this to me, or that my parents were so quick to take her side." Katie didn't interrupt, just listened, nodding with that empathetic look she always gave when I needed her the most. "It's like all the years I spent trying to be the good daughter don't even matter. They'll always choose her." Katie reached over, squeezing my hand. "You don't deserve this, Sam. None of it. You did something selfless, and they couldn't see it. That's on them, not you." Her words helped, but the ache in my chest didn't go away. A few months later, I visited my grandparents, hoping to find a little comfort away from the tension with my parents and Madison. But the moment I walked in, I could feel something was off. The usual warmth wasn't there. Instead, I was met with awkward nods and forced smiles. As I sat down, I overheard my Aunt Linda murmuring to one of my cousins, "It's just sad, isn't it? You'd think Samantha could have been happy for her sister instead of trying to cause trouble." My stomach dropped. I turned to look at her, but she quickly looked away, pretending she hadn't just said something loud enough for me to hear. My grandmother, sensing the shift, tried to smooth things over, handing me a plate of cookies like that would somehow fix the tension. "You know, sweetie," she said gently, "Madison's been so good to your parents. It's really inspiring how much she's stepped up for them." My chest tightened as I realized Madison had poisoned the well. They all believed her version of events, and I was the ungrateful troublemaker in their eyes. I stayed just long enough to be polite, but by the time I left, the lump in my throat felt like it would never go away. Leaving my grandparents' house that day felt heavier than I expected. The words I overheard replayed in my mind like a broken record, each one stinging more than the last. It wasn't just the unfairness of it. It was the realization that Madison had gone out of her way to tarnish me to people who were supposed to love me. It was infuriating, but more than that, it hurt. And when I got home, I sat in my car for a while, gripping the steering wheel and staring at nothing. The worst part wasn't just that my family believed her lies. It was knowing that no matter what I said, they'd already made up their minds. Sitting in my car, I reminded myself of the cold, hard truth. There was no way I could prove it. I had been so focused on making the gift anonymous that I hadn't left a single shred of evidence. No receipts, no bank transfers, nothing. Just an envelope stuffed with cash dropped into their mailbox. And since everyone believed Madison, what could I do? If my own parents didn't trust me, what chance did I have with the rest of the family? It felt like I was screaming into a void, and no one cared enough to listen. The reality was painfully clear. There was nothing I could say or do to change their minds. All I could do now was walk away and try to rebuild my life without their approval. As I sat there staring blankly through the windshield, a single thought kept looping in my mind. I needed a miracle. Something out of the ordinary. Something that would turn the tables and finally make them see the truth. It wasn't enough to just walk away. I wanted justice. I wanted them to know who I really was, not the villain Madison had painted me to be. But what could that miracle even look like? I had no proof, no way to back up my side of the story. For months, I'd stayed quiet, trying to keep my dignity intact, but now it felt like silence was my enemy. Something had to give. I just didn't know how or when, but deep down, I held on to the hope that someday, something would happen to expose Madison for who she really was. Just as I was spiraling in my thoughts, my phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I grabbed it, expecting a spam notification or a random update. But when I unlocked it, my heart skipped a beat. It was a message from Madison. "Hey, Sam. I really need to talk to you. It's important." I stared at the screen, my emotions swirling between anger, suspicion, and curiosity. Madison hadn't reached out to me in months. The timing couldn't have been more surreal, but I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in my gut that whatever she wanted, it wouldn't be good. Still, a part of me couldn't resist the urge to find out what she had to say. I stared at Madison's message for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the screen. Every instinct told me to respond right away, to demand to know what she wanted. But then I stopped myself. Madison had spent months twisting the narrative and letting everyone think the worst of me. She could wait. I put my phone down and decided not to let her urgency dictate my response. Whatever was so important could wait until I was ready. The next day, after a long night of restless sleep and careful consideration, I finally replied, "What's so important, Madison? Make it quick." I wasn't in the mood for games, and I wasn't about to let her think I was eager to hear from her. Madison replied almost instantly, like she'd been waiting for my response. "Can I come over? I really need your help, Sam. I'm in a tough spot." The tone of her message was pleading, which wasn't like her. Madison rarely admitted to needing anyone, let alone me. I debated for a moment before typing back, "What kind of help are we talking about?" I wasn't about to let her waltz in and dump her problems on me without a clear explanation. Whatever this was, I wasn't going to let her manipulate me into another mess. Not again. Her next message came quickly. "I'm struggling financially. I can't keep up with everything, and I don't know where else to turn. Please, Sam, just hear me out." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head at the irony of it all. Madison, the golden child who could do no wrong, was now coming to me for help. The same sister who'd lied to our parents and dragged my name through the mud was suddenly desperate enough to ask for my assistance. Part of me wanted to ignore her, to let her deal with the mess she'd made. But another part, the one that still wanted some sort of justice, knew this might be the opportunity I'd been waiting for. I typed back, "Fine, come over tomorrow. We'll talk." If she wanted my help, she was going to have to play by my rules this time. The next afternoon, Madison showed up at my door, looking nothing like her usual self. Her hair was tied back in a messy bun, her face pale and drawn, and she was wearing an old hoodie I hadn't seen in years. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her, but then I reminded myself why she was here. "I didn't know where else to go," she said, as I stepped aside to let her in. She sat on the edge of my couch, fidgeting with her hands, avoiding my eyes. "Things have been really hard, Sam. I'm behind on rent, my credit cards are maxed out, and I can barely afford groceries. I don't know what else to do." I leaned against the wall, arms crossed, keeping my tone steady. "So, you're asking me for money?" I said bluntly. She flinched, but she didn't deny it. "After everything you've done, you think I'm just going to bail you out?" The room was silent except for the faint sound of her breathing, and I could see her struggling to come up with the right words. Madison looked up at me, her eyes wide and desperate. "I've already asked everyone else, Sam. Friends, acquaintances, anyone I could think of. I didn't want to drag Mom and Dad into this, and I figured I couldn't exactly go to the rest of the family after—" She trailed off, looking down at her hands. I raised an eyebrow. "After what? After lying to them for months about something you didn't do?" I asked sharply. She winced but didn't argue. "So, let me get this straight. You've exhausted all your options and now I'm your last resort? The sister you lied about and threw under the bus?" She nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I don't deserve it, but I didn't know who else to turn to. Please, Sam, I'm begging you." For a moment, I just stood there staring at her, weighing my options. A part of me wanted to slam the door in her face, but another part saw an opportunity, a way to finally set the record straight. I took a deep breath, shaking my head as I looked at her. "No, Madison," I said firmly. Her head snapped up, her eyes widening in shock. "I'm not giving you money. Not after everything you've done." She looked like she was about to cry. "Sam, please, I wouldn't be here if I had any other choice. I'm desperate." "I'm sure you are," I said, my tone cold. "But you made your choices, Madison. You lied to our family, you threw me under the bus, and now you expect me to help you out? That's not going to happen." I crossed my arms, standing my ground. For the first time, I felt no guilt, just a sense of clarity. Madison stared at me for a long moment, her shoulders slumping as she realized I wasn't going to change my mind. She stood up slowly, grabbing her bag with trembling hands. "I get it," she said softly, her voice heavy with sadness. "I know I messed up, and I don't deserve your help. I didn't know where else to go." She paused at the door, glancing back at me with red-rimmed eyes. "I'm sorry, Sam, for everything. I really am." Her voice cracked on the last word, and before I could say anything, she opened the door and stepped out, closing it quietly behind her. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the empty space she'd left behind. I wasn't sure what I felt, relief, maybe, or just exhaustion, but I knew I'd made the right decision. A few days later, my phone buzzed while I was in the middle of making coffee. I glanced at the screen and saw my dad's name. It wasn't often he called me directly, so I answered, curiosity and a little apprehension building in my chest. "Hi, Dad," I said, trying to sound casual. "Samantha," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "We were hoping you could come to dinner this Friday. Madison's asked to see us all, and she says it's important. Your mom and I think it would mean a lot if you were there." I froze for a moment, my mind racing. Madison? Important? It didn't take much to figure out this wasn't going to be a normal family dinner. "Did she say what it's about?" I asked, my tone guarded. "No, just that it's something she needs to do in person," he said. "Please, Sam, it would mean a lot to all of us." His voice was calm, but I could sense the unspoken plea in his words. I hesitated, but eventually agreed. "All right, I'll be there," I said, though part of me was already bracing for whatever was coming. Friday evening, I pulled into my parents' driveway, my stomach churning. I sat in the car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my thoughts. Whatever Madison had planned, it was clear this wasn't going to be a simple family dinner. After taking a deep breath, I grabbed my bag and headed inside. The house smelled like my mom's pot roast, a familiar scent that usually brought comfort, but tonight only made my stomach tighten further. As I stepped into the dining room, I saw my parents, my grandparents, and Madison already seated around the table. My grandparents smiled at me warmly, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. Madison looked down at her hands, fidgeting nervously. My dad stood as I entered, giving me a hesitant smile. "Samantha, glad you're here," he said, motioning to the empty chair next to him. I nodded silently, taking my seat, my gaze flickering to Madison, waiting to see what this important meeting was really about. Just as the awkward silence began to stretch, Madison let out a shaky breath. Before anyone could react, she broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Her shoulders shook as she buried her face in her hands, the sound echoing in the room. My mom gasped, rushing to her side, while my grandparents exchanged confused looks. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" my mom asked, placing a hand on Madison's back, her voice full of concern. My dad leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Madison, what's going on?" I didn't move. I didn't need an explanation because I already knew. Watching her unravel, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, vindication, and an odd sense of pity. This was it. She was cracking under the weight of everything she'd done. I stayed silent, waiting to see what she'd say next, the tension in the room so thick it was almost suffocating. Through her sobs, Madison began to speak, her voice trembling but loud enough to silence the room. "I can't keep lying anymore," she choked out, tears streaming down her face. "The $10,000, it wasn't from me. It was Samantha. She's the one who left the money in the mailbox." She paused, her chest heaving as she tried to collect herself. "I took the credit because I wanted to feel even more loved, more appreciated. I've never felt like I was in anyone's shadow. Mom and Dad have always protected me, always supported me. But I wanted more. When I saw what Samantha had done, I was jealous. I wanted to be seen as the one who could do something that big, something that meaningful." She glanced at my parents, her face pale and full of regret. I didn't think about how much it would hurt her, or what it would do to all of us. I just wanted to hold on to that feeling of being special. And when Samantha tried to speak up, I lied again. I panicked because I didn't want to lose the way you looked at me. I didn't want to lose being the one you were proud of. Finally, she looked at me, her voice breaking completely. "I'm so sorry, Sam. You didn't deserve any of this. I was selfish, and I let it go too far." She broke down again, her head in her hands, as the room fell into stunned silence, everyone too shocked to speak. As Madison spoke, I sat frozen in my chair, a storm of emotion swirling inside me. Anger, vindication, disbelief, sadness, it all hit me at once. Hearing her finally admit the truth after all this time should have felt satisfying. But it didn't. Instead, there was a hollow ache in my chest, a reminder of everything her lies had taken from me. My relationship with our parents, my place in the family, my peace of mind. I glanced at my mom and dad, their faces pale with shock, their eyes flickering between me and Madison as they tried to piece it all together. They looked devastated, but I couldn't find it in me to feel sorry for them. They'd chosen to believe her over me, and now they were seeing the fallout of that choice. Part of me wanted to scream, "I told you so," but I stayed quiet, letting Madison's words hang heavy in the room. This was her moment to face the consequences, and I wasn't going to take that away from her. But still, as much as I wanted justice, I couldn't shake the hurt of knowing it took her this long to finally come clean. My mom was the first to speak, her voice shaky and thick with emotion. "Samantha, I don't even know what to say," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "We were so blind, so quick to assume you were just being jealous. We never even considered that you might have been telling the truth. And now I see how unfair we've been to you. My dad nodded, his face pale and full of guilt. "We should have listened, Sam. We should have trusted you instead of shutting you down. I can't believe we let this go on for so long. I'm so sorry for everything we said, for doubting you. You didn't deserve that, not from us." They looked devastated, their regret plain on their faces. I could see my mom's hands trembling as she reached across the table, her voice breaking. "We let you down, sweetheart. We're so sorry. Can you ever forgive us?" Their words should have brought some comfort, but all I could feel in that moment was a mixture of sadness and exhaustion. They were sorry now, but the damage had already been done. I glanced over at my grandparents, and the sadness on their faces was unmistakable. My grandmother's lips were pressed into a thin line, her eyes glistening as she looked down at her hands. My grandfather shook his head slowly, his expression a mix of disappointment and heartbreak. They didn't say a word, but the weight of their silence spoke volumes. They couldn't believe what they'd just heard. Days went by, and I couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. Madison's confession, my parents' apologies, the way my grandparents had looked at me, it all replayed in my mind like a movie I couldn't turn off. I thought about Madison, how broken she'd seemed, and for the first time, I let myself see past the anger and hurt. She'd made a mess, yes, but she was finally trying to take responsibility. Maybe, just maybe, she deserved a second chance, not through money, but through guidance. After a lot of thought, I called her. "Madison," I said, my voice firm but calm, "I've decided to help you, not by handing you money, but by helping you figure out how to get back on track. We'll sit down, go over your finances, and organize a plan to fix this, but only if you're ready to take it seriously." She was quiet for a moment before she agreed, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was a start. And for the first time, I felt like I was taking a step toward healing, not just for me, but for both of us. After everything, I felt lighter, like a weight I'd been carrying for a long time had finally been lifted. The anger and hurt didn't disappear overnight, but I no longer felt trapped by them. I'd stood my ground, found my voice, and taken control of my own peace. For the first time, I felt like I could move forward, not for anyone else, but for myself, and that was enough. "Wait, what?" I blurted out, nearly choking on my drink. Vanessa's voice cut through the chatter like a blade. "It was me," she said, her smile spreading as she basked in the sudden attention. My stepfather's face lit up with gratitude, and my mom's eyes filled with tears of pride. The room went silent save for the hum of the ceiling fan. I sat frozen, my hands clenched in my lap, every muscle in my body tensed. She couldn't have just said that, not after what I told her in confidence. "My name is Jessica Neal. I'm 29 years old and work as a social worker. For as long as I can remember, I've been the kind of person who avoids drama and does what needs to be done without making a scene. A little over a year ago, my stepfather, Rob, was diagnosed with cancer. It devastated our family, especially my mom, who loves him more than anything. When the medical bills started piling up, I knew I had to do something. That's why I used my savings to pay off his debt, anonymously. The only person I had told about it was Vanessa, my older stepsister, someone I thought I could trust. It was supposed to be a celebratory dinner. Rob had just gotten a clean bill of health, and my mom wanted to mark the occasion with something special. She made her famous pot roast, the one Rob always says tastes better than his mom's used to. The house smelled of rosemary and garlic. The dining table was set with her good plates, and there was an extra chair squeezed in to accommodate Vanessa's husband, Derek. Everyone seemed happy, really happy, for the first time in what felt like years. I sat between my mom and Derek, trying to join in the light-hearted conversation, but my mind kept drifting. I felt a warmth in my chest every time Rob laughed, knowing he could finally relax without the weight of those hospital bills. He'd even made a toast to the Good Samaritan who paid off the debt, thanking them for their generosity. I had smiled quietly into my glass, content to keep my secret. That was when Rob, out of nowhere, asked, "Was it one of you?" His eyes scanned the table, hopeful but not pressing. My heart sped up, but before I could decide how to react, Vanessa leaned back in her chair, grinning like a Cheshire cat, and said, "It was me." I stared at her, my throat tightening as the room erupted into applause. My mom's face lit up with pride, and she reached across the table to squeeze Vanessa's hand. "I knew it," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You've always had such a big heart." Rob looked at her like she was some kind of hero, his voice soft as he said, "Thank you, sweetheart. I don't even know what to say." But it was Derek's reaction that really caught me off guard. He blinked, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth, and then said, "Wait, you did this? When?" Vanessa didn't even flinch. She turned to him with that same syrupy smile and said, "Of course I did. I didn't tell you because I wanted it to be a surprise." Derek stared at her for a moment, clearly trying to process what she'd just said, but then shrugged and went along with it, muttering something about how proud he was. Meanwhile, I sat there in stunned silence, my hands gripping the napkin in my lap so tightly I thought it might tear. She had lied not just to the family, but to her own husband. And the worst part? She didn't even hesitate. Dinner carried on as if nothing had happened. Rob shared stories from his treatment days, making us laugh with his descriptions of the grumpy nurses who eventually warmed up to him. My mom kept chiming in about how strong he had been through it all, and Derek cracked jokes about how Rob must have charmed the doctors to get extra Jell-O cups. The mood was light, warm, exactly what you'd expect at a dinner celebrating a second chance at life. But Vanessa wouldn't look at me. Not once. Every time I glanced her way, she avoided my eyes, focusing intently on her plate or making a point of talking to anyone else at the table. It was like she knew I was daring her to meet my gaze, to acknowledge what she'd done. Her fake smiles and easy laughs didn't fool me for a second. Beneath all her charm, I could see the tension in her shoulders, the tight grip on her wine glass. She knew I wasn't going to forget this, even if I stayed silent for Rob's sake. When dinner finally ended, I could barely get out of there fast enough. I hugged my mom and Rob, told them how proud I was of him for staying strong through everything, and slipped on my coat. Vanessa gave me a quick, perfunctory smile as I walked past her, but I didn't bother trying to say goodbye. My mom called after me to drive safe, but I could barely hear her over the rush of thoughts in my head as I stepped into the cold night air. The drive home felt like it lasted forever. I replayed the night over and over, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It should have been a celebration, a moment of relief after everything Rob and my mom had been through. Instead, it had turned into this bizarre charade. I kept asking myself how Vanessa could sit there and lie to everyone like that, how she could look Rob in the eyes and take credit for something she had no part in. And the worst part? I'd let her. I let her steal the moment because I didn't want to ruin the night for Rob. But now, sitting alone in my apartment, the silence felt unbearable, and I couldn't stop wondering if I'd made the right choice. As I sat on my couch, staring blankly at the TV that I hadn't even bothered to turn on, I knew deep down what I had to do, or rather, what I couldn't do. Telling Rob the truth might have cleared my conscience, but what good would it do for him? He'd been through so much already, and he was just starting to feel like himself again. The last thing he needed was to be dragged into some ugly fight between Vanessa and me. He didn't deserve that, not after fighting so hard to beat cancer. And I convinced myself that staying quiet was the right thing to do. Rob's peace of mind mattered more than my anger or frustration. As much as I wanted him to know the truth, that I was the one who had his back when he needed it most, it wouldn't change anything for him now. If anything, it might make him feel guilty for celebrating Vanessa when he should have been thanking me. And honestly, he didn't need guilt. He needed to heal, to be happy, to focus on living. So, I decided to let it go, for him, if not for me. The next morning, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I called Vanessa while sitting at my kitchen table, my coffee untouched and growing cold. The phone rang twice before she picked up, her tone bright and casual, like nothing had happened. "Hey, Jess," she said, as if we were best friends. "What's up?" I didn't waste time. We need to talk about last night, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. There was a pause, just long enough to feel heavy. What about it? She finally asked, though I could hear the tension creeping into her tone. You know what? I shot back. Why did you lie to everyone and say you paid off Rob's bills? We know that wasn't you. I told you in confidence. How could you do that to me? Vanessa sighed heavily on the other end of the line. Jess, look, it's not a big deal. I didn't think you'd be this upset. Not a big deal? I snapped, gripping my phone tighter. You stood there and lied to everyone, Vanessa. You took credit for something you didn't do, something I sacrificed a lot for. How is that not a big deal? She hesitated, and for a second, her voice softened. I just wanted to make Dad proud of me. He's always been proud of you, Jess. You're the selfless one, the one who helps everyone. I didn't think you'd mind if, just this once, I could have that moment with him. I was stunned. Are you kidding me? This wasn't just some harmless lie, Vanessa. You know what I went through to make that happen. I emptied my savings account so Mom wouldn't have to stress about the bills, so Rob could focus on getting better. And you thought I wouldn't mind? I thought it'd be fine, she snapped back, her voice sharper now. I didn't think you'd actually care who got the credit. I mean, you didn't even want to tell him, right? You were happy to let it be anonymous. So what does it matter if he thinks it was me? It's not about the credit, Vanessa, I said, my voice steady but firm. I didn't do this to be thanked or celebrated. I didn't even want Rob to know it was me. But lying? That's a completely different matter. You knew it wasn't you, and you let everyone believe it was. You let Mom and Rob look at you like you were some kind of savior. How can you live with that? Vanessa let out an exasperated sigh. Jess, you're blowing this out of proportion. It's not like I hurt anyone. Rob's happy, Mom's happy. What difference does it make? You're the one who said you didn't want recognition, so why does it matter who they think did it? It matters because it's a lie, I snapped. You've turned something that should have been about helping Rob into a way to stroke your ego. And now I'm stuck sitting here, watching everyone praise you for something you didn't do. Do you know how humiliating that is for me? Not because I want the attention, but because it's a betrayal, Vanessa. You betrayed me. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, Vanessa said quietly, almost defensively, I didn't mean to hurt you, Jess. I wanted to feel like I was enough, for once. Like I mattered. I'm not going to tell your dad, I said, my voice cold and measured. Not because of you, but because of him. He's been through enough, and I won't add this to his plate. But Vanessa... I paused, taking a shaky breath. I want you out of my life. I can't keep pretending that what you did doesn't matter. Jess, come on, she said, her voice rising with panic. You can't be serious. You're really going to throw our relationship away over this? I told you I didn't mean to hurt you. You didn't mean to hurt me, I repeated, disbelief dripping from every word. You lied to my face, you lied to your own husband, and you stole something that wasn't yours to take. You knew how much that sacrifice meant to me. And for what? To make yourself feel better? No, Vanessa. I can't trust you anymore. She started to say something, but I cut her off. One day your conscience is going to catch up with you. Maybe not today, maybe not even next year, but it will. And when it does, I hope you think about this moment, about the sister you pushed away just to make yourself look good. My voice cracked, but I held firm. I hope it was worth it. Vanessa didn't reply. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, until I finally hung up. I sat there staring at the phone, my hands trembling, the weight of everything sinking in. I felt raw and hollow, but at least I'd finally said what I needed to say. A year passed, but things between Vanessa and me never went back to normal. We still saw each other at family gatherings, birthdays, holidays, the occasional barbecue, but we might as well have been strangers. Conversations were polite but hollow, and we avoided being alone in the same room. The tension between us wasn't just noticeable, it was impossible to ignore. Mom was the first to bring it up. After a family dinner one night, She pulled me aside, her brow furrowed with worry. "Jessica," she said softly, "what's going on between you and Vanessa? You two used to be so close." I shrugged, trying to play it off. "We're fine, Mom. Just busy with life, I guess." But I could see she wasn't convinced. Rob had noticed it too. At Christmas, he asked why Vanessa and I didn't sit together anymore. "You two used to laugh so much," he'd said. I forced a smile and changed the subject, but it stung more than I expected. A few months after that Christmas dinner, Vanessa started reaching out. It was subtle at first, texts here and there. "Hey, how's work going?" Or, "Mom said you've been really busy, hope you're okay." I ignored every single one. I couldn't bring myself to engage with her. Each message felt like a tiny jab, a reminder of what she'd done and how easily she had betrayed me. At family gatherings, she tried harder. She'd make small talk or ask me questions about my job, but I kept my answers short and polite, giving her no room to dig deeper. At one dinner, she cornered me in the kitchen while I was refilling my drink. "Jess, I know things haven't been great between us, but maybe we could grab coffee sometime? Just talk?" I didn't even look at her. "I'm busy," I said flatly, brushing past her. She sighed, but I didn't stop to see her reaction. Whatever she was trying to do, it wasn't enough to erase the past year. A few weeks after that awkward dinner, Mom mentioned something that caught me off guard. "Vanessa's been going to church," she said, her tone almost hesitant, like she wasn't sure how I'd react. "She's been feeling, I don't know, empty, I guess." She told me she's been thinking a lot about life and wanting to make some changes. I raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. Vanessa, going to church? It didn't add up. She'd never been the religious type. Always too busy, too modern for anything like that. Mom must have noticed my skepticism because she added, "I think it's good for her. She seems calmer lately, more reflective. Maybe this is exactly what she needs." I nodded absent-mindedly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was another one of Vanessa's attempts to patch things up. If it was, I wasn't buying it. People don't just change overnight, and I wasn't ready to let my guard down. One evening, as I was settling onto the couch with a book, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I glanced at the screen and saw Vanessa's name. My first instinct was to let it go to voicemail, like I had so many times before. But something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity or a nagging sense that this wasn't just another one of her surface-level attempts to reach out. Against my better judgment, I picked up. "Jess," she said softly, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I need to tell you something." I stayed silent, gripping the phone tighter. She took a deep breath and continued. "I've been struggling with what I did, what I said that night." Her voice cracked, and I could hear the emotion in her words. "It's been eating at me, Jess. I thought I could just move on, pretend like it didn't matter, but it does. It matters a lot. I couldn't help myself." The words came out before I had a chance to soften them. "Should I tell you I told you so?" My voice was sharp, edged with all the frustration I'd been holding on to for the past year. On the other end of the line, Vanessa let out a shaky sigh, and for a moment, I thought she might hang up. "You have every right to say that," she finally replied, her tone raw. "You warned me, Jess, and you were right. I thought I could live with it, but I can't. Every time Dad looks at me with that pride in his eyes, it feels like a dagger. I know I don't deserve it. And you? I know I don't deserve your forgiveness either." Vanessa's voice wavered as she continued. "I've thought about coming clean so many times, Jess, but I'm terrified. What's Dad going to think of me? What's Mom going to say when she realizes I lied to her face? And Derek, he didn't even know what I did that night. How do I explain that to him?" I stayed quiet for a moment, letting her words sink in. For all the pain she'd caused me, I could hear genuine fear and guilt in her voice. "You're afraid of their reaction," I said, keeping my tone steady. "But what did you think was going to happen when you took credit for something you didn't do? Did you honestly think it wouldn't catch up with you eventually? I let out a slow breath, trying to steady myself. Vanessa, I'm not going to force you to do anything, I said, my voice calm but firm. This is your mess, and you're the one who has to deal with it. I already made my decision a long time ago to stay quiet for your dad's sake. But your guilt, your conscience, that's on you. No one can fix that but you. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, she whispered, I don't know if I can, Jess. I don't know if I'm strong enough to face it. I shook my head, even though she couldn't see me. You're going to have to figure that out for yourself. I hung up. I let out a slow breath, trying to steady myself. Vanessa, I'm not going to force you to do anything, I said, my voice calm but firm. This is your mess, and you're the one who has to deal with it. I already made my decision a long time ago to stay quiet for your dad's sake. But your guilt, your conscience, that's on you. No one can fix that but you. Before she could respond, I added, You're going to have to figure that out for yourself. Then, without waiting for her reply, I hung up the phone. I stared at the screen for a moment, my heart pounding, a mix of emotions swirling inside me. Relief, anger, and oddly enough, pity. I wasn't sure if Vanessa would ever own up to what she'd done, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't carrying her guilt anymore. A few weeks later, I got a group text from Vanessa. It was an invitation to a family dinner at her house, something she hadn't done in ages. I'd love to have everyone over, the message read, with an overly cheery tone that felt forced. Just a casual evening, good food, good company. I stared at the screen, debating whether to respond. It felt out of the blue, especially after our last conversation. Mom quickly replied, Sounds wonderful, we'll be there. Rob chimed in with a thumbs-up emoji, and even Derek added, Looking forward to it. I reluctantly typed back, I'll come. The evening came faster than I expected. I pulled into Vanessa's driveway, already bracing myself for whatever she was planning. Her house was immaculate, the lights warm and inviting. Through the window, I could see the dining table set with care, complete with candles and what looked like her best china. As I stepped inside, Vanessa greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Jess, she said softly, thanks for coming. I nodded but didn't say much, still unsure of what she was up to. Once everyone had arrived and settled in, Vanessa cleared her throat and stood near the fireplace. Can I have everyone's attention for a minute? She said, her voice shaking just slightly. The cheerful chatter died down as we all turned to look at her. She clasped her hands together, glancing at Derek for support before looking at the rest of us. There's something I need to say. Something I've needed to say for a long time. Vanessa took a deep breath, her fingers trembling slightly as she clasped them in front of her. I've made some terrible mistakes in the past, she began, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. One mistake in particular. It hurt someone I care about deeply, and it's been weighing on me ever since. She paused and glanced at Derek, who gave her a small, encouraging nod from his seat beside her. He placed a hand on her shoulder, and she seemed to draw strength from it. I've been struggling with how to handle it, and I've been talking to my priest. He's been helping me realize that the only way to move forward is to face it. Rob leaned forward in his chair, his expression tense. Vanessa, he said, his voice filled with concern. What is it? What mistake are you talking about? His hands gripped the armrest tightly, his anxiety visible, while Mom's hand rested lightly on his arm, her own confusion etched across her face. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint tick of the wall clock as we all waited for her to continue. Vanessa took another deep breath, her voice shaking now as she began. Last year, when Dad was recovering from his treatment, there was something I did that I've regretted every single day since. She looked down at her hands, her composure starting to crack. At the dinner, we had to celebrate his recovery. When he mentioned that someone had paid off his medical debt, I lied. I told everyone it was me. She glanced around the room, her eyes filled with tears as she continued. But it wasn't me. It was Jessica. The weight of her words hung in the air, and I felt every pair of eyes shift to me. Jessica was the one who used her savings to pay off the debt. She was the one who made sure Dad and Mom didn't have to worry about the bills. And I took credit for it. I took her sacrifice and made it my own, because I wanted Dad to be proud of me. I wanted to feel like I was enough, just for once. Her voice broke as she dropped to her knees, her hands clasped in front of her like she was praying. Tears streamed down her face. "I'm so sorry. Jess, I betrayed you. I lied to everyone, and I hurt you in a way I can never take back. Dad, Mom, I don't even know what to say. I've been carrying this guilt for so long and I couldn't hide from it anymore. Please, please forgive me. I know I don't deserve it, but I had to tell you the truth." The room was silent except for her quiet sobs. Derek reached out to steady her, his hand resting on her shoulder, but she stayed on her knees, her face crumpled with regret. Rob looked at her, his face pale and stunned, while Mom's hand shot up to cover her mouth. All eyes turned to me, waiting for my reaction. Through her sobs, Vanessa continued, her voice raw and broken. "Jessica, she's an angel. She's the most selfless person I've ever known. She didn't tell Dad what I did, not because she couldn't, but because she didn't want him to worry. She cared more about his peace of mind than about what I took from her. She's so good, so selfless, that she didn't even want him to know she was the one who paid the bills in the first place." Her shoulders shook as she wiped her face with trembling hands. "I've spent this past year hating myself for what I did to you, Jess. I don't know how you stayed so quiet, how you kept all of that inside while I took what was yours. You're so much better than me. I could never be like you, but I wish I could. I wish I had your strength, your kindness. I've spent my whole life trying to feel like I'm enough. And I realize now that it wasn't you I was competing with. It was myself." Vanessa buried her face in her hands, the room heavy with the sound of her sobs. Derek knelt beside her, gently wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Rob and Mom sat frozen, their faces a mixture of shock and deep emotion. I didn't know what to say, my heart twisting in ways I hadn't expected. It's been 6 months since that night. 6 months since Vanessa got down on her knees and told the truth in front of everyone. Things haven't gone back to the way they were, and honestly, I don't think they ever will. But they've changed in ways I didn't expect. Vanessa has been different, quieter, more reflective. She still reaches out, though I can tell it's hard for her. She sends texts sometimes, small things like, "Saw this and thought of you," or "Mom said you weren't feeling well. Hope you're okay." Rob and Mom handled the truth better than I thought they would. Rob was disappointed in Vanessa, I could see that, but his love for her didn't waver. And with me, he's been even warmer, always finding little ways to show his gratitude, like saving me the best piece of pie at dinner or asking about my work in a way that feels genuine. It's strange, but I think in some ways that night brought us closer as a family. Not perfect, but closer. As for Vanessa, she's still trying to be the best version of herself, and for the first time, I think she means it.